What unfolded here did not look like a single battle, it looked like the ocean tearing itself apart. Across hundreds of miles of open water, in scattered engagements that overlapped, collided, and nearly spiraled out of control, the largest naval battle in history erupted without a clear beginning or a clean ending. Fleets moved in fragments, orders arrived too late. Decisions made by a handful of commanders would determine the fate of entire oceans. This was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, not a duel, not a set piece, but a cascading series of encounters where victory and catastrophe often came down to minutes, weather, and miscalculation. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had entered its decisive phase. The Allies were returning to the Philippines. Japan's perimeter was collapsing. Resources were running dry. Leyte was not just another landing. It was a threat to everything Japan still held in Southeast Asia. If the Philippines fell, Japan's remaining access to oil and raw materials would be severed. The war would become unsustainable. Japan could not allow that to happen. What followed was a plan born of desperation. Every remaining major surface unit was committed. Battleships, cruisers, carriers, many of them damaged, undercrewed, or short on fuel, were thrown into a final, sprawling counterstroke designed to shatter the invasion fleet. It was not a plan built for survival. It was built for one last chance. The battle did not unfold in one place. It fractured into chaos. In the Sibuyan Sea, air power battered the heart of the Japanese fleet, sinking battleships once thought nearly invulnerable. In Surigao Strait, old battleships fought their last classic engagement, crossing the enemy's path in a maneuver straight out of another era. Off Samar, lightly armed escort carriers found themselves facing heavy cruisers and battleships in a confrontation no one had planned, and survived through courage that bordered on defiance. This was not war as choreography. It was war as collision. Pilots attacked without knowing what lay beyond the next cloud. Surface ships charged enemies far heavier than themselves. Commanders made decisions with incomplete maps and fading communication. For the Americans, Leyte Gulf tested whether dominance at sea had truly been achieved, or whether it could still be ripped away by surprise and sacrifice. For Japan, it was the final attempt to reverse a tide that had already turned too far to stop, and threaded through all of it was something new. Kamikaze attacks appeared not as symbolism, but as calculation, an acknowledgement that conventional means were no longer enough. The battle marked a shift not just in strategy, but in mindset. The war was entering a darker phase. When the smoke cleared, the outcome was unmistakable. Japan's surface fleet was shattered beyond recovery. The ability to contest Allied naval dominance was gone. The Pacific War entered its final chapter. But Leyte Gulf was not a clean victory. It was confusion survived. It was disaster narrowly avoided. It was a reminder that even overwhelming power can be tested and nearly undone when war spreads beyond control. The Battle of Leyte Gulf matters because it shows how wars end at sea, not with one decisive blow, but with systems collapsing under pressure, with courage compensating for chaos, with fleets expending themselves because there is nothing left to preserve. Tonight, we return to those waters, to the straits and open seas, to the moments when history could have turned differently, and did not, to the battle that decided the Pacific, not in one clash, but in many. This is the history of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment and hear from you. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now, and what time is it for you there? Is this a late night listen, an early morning start, or a quiet moment carved out just for history? And if these long immersive journeys into the past help you slow down, think clearly, or feel grounded, I hope you'll consider subscribing. Every subscription helps keep this calm, in-depth style of storytelling alive. If this feels like a place you want to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the story of Leyte Gulf. March 17, 1942, Corregidor Island, Manila Bay. The concrete trembled beneath Douglas MacArthur's boots as Japanese artillery shells exploded across the fortress. For 4 months, the American garrison had held this rocky outcrop, while the empire collapsed around them. Now, in the humid darkness before midnight, the 52-year-old general descended into a tunnel carved deep into Malinta Hill, his jaw set against what he considered the greatest humiliation of his life. President Roosevelt had ordered him to abandon his command, to flee the Philippines while his men stayed behind to face certain death or capture. Outside, in the blackness of the bay, 4 patrol torpedo boats waited with engines idling, their crews watching the orange flashes on Bataan Peninsula across the water. MacArthur would later call this moment his darkest hour, but in the boat's cramped cabin, racing through Japanese-controlled waters toward the southern islands, something else was taking shape inside him. Not acceptance, but an obsession that would reshape the entire course of the Pacific War. The journey to Australia took 4 days of hell. PT-41 and its sister boats dodged Japanese destroyers, navigated through reefs without charts, and endured seas so rough that everyone aboard spent hours vomiting over the side. MacArthur's wife Jean and their 4-year-old son Arthur huddled in the cramped compartment while spray soaked everyone to the skin. When they finally reached Mindanao, transferring to B-17 bombers for the flight to Melbourne, MacArthur had already composed the words that would define the next 3 years. He had written them in his mind during those long hours at sea, refining each syllable, understanding instinctively that language could become strategy. The phrase, "I shall return," wasn't simply a promise. It was a declaration of intent that transformed military retreat into personal crusade, that made the liberation of 20 million Filipinos inseparable from the redemption of one man's reputation. The radio broadcast from Melbourne on March 20th sent shockwaves through both Allied and Japanese headquarters. Standing before microphones in his new office, MacArthur delivered his message with the dramatic flair of a Shakespearean actor. "I came through and I shall return," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across shortwave frequencies to the occupied Philippines. That single word, "I," instead of the collective "we," ignited immediate controversy in Washington. Navy admirals bristled at what they saw as ego masquerading as strategy. President Roosevelt raised his eyebrows when he read the transcript. Even MacArthur's own staff officers had suggested softer language. But MacArthur understood something about human psychology that the bureaucrats missed. People follow individuals, not committees. Filipino guerrillas hiding in the mountains needed a name to rally behind, a personality to trust. Millions living under brutal Japanese occupation needed hope, personified, not an abstract promise from a distant government. What followed became one of the most intense strategic arguments of World War II. 18 months of bureaucratic warfare fought in conference rooms from Washington to Pearl Harbor. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, advocated loudly for bypassing the Philippines entirely. His plan called for striking directly at Formosa, modern Taiwan, cutting off Japan's supply lines to Southeast Asia, while avoiding what he considered MacArthur's sentimental obsession. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, initially supported King's assessment. The numbers seemed to justify their position. Capturing the Philippines would require landing 105,000 troops on defended beaches, fighting through jungle and city for months, sustaining casualties estimated in the tens of thousands. Formosa offered strategic position without emotional baggage, but MacArthur fought back with every weapon in his political arsenal. Leaked press reports, congressional allies, carefully crafted letters to Roosevelt emphasizing moral obligations and American honor. He argued that abandoning 20 million Filipinos would destroy American credibility throughout Asia for generations. The guerrilla networks gave MacArthur his strongest argument. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, resistance fighters in the Philippines maintained radio contact with MacArthur's headquarters. 20,000 guerrillas, organized into dozens of units across the archipelago, gathered intelligence on Japanese troop movements, harbor activities, fortification construction. They rescued downed American pilots, sabotaged supply lines, and most importantly, kept MacArthur's promise alive among the civilian population. Farmers would whisper about it while planting rice. Fishermen repeated it while mending nets. Teachers told their students that General MacArthur was coming back, that liberation was not a question of if, but when. This grassroots intelligence network provided detailed information that Navy planners couldn't match for Formosa, precise maps of Japanese strongpoints, accurate counts of garrison strength, identification of collaborators and resistance sympathizers. MacArthur could promise Roosevelt not just victory, but victory informed by boots on the ground, eyes in every village, ears in every Japanese headquarters. The political calculation shifted in Roosevelt's mind during the summer of 1944. This was an election year, and FDR faced his 4th presidential campaign, with the war's outcome still uncertain. MacArthur, despite his exile to the Southwest Pacific, remained wildly popular with the American public. Newsreels showed him stern and resolute. Magazines printed his dramatic quotes. Mothers named their babies Douglas. Roosevelt recognized a potential political threat. MacArthur had Republican connections, military prestige, and just enough ego to consider challenging a sitting president. Better to let him have his Philippines campaign than force him into open opposition. During a conference in Pearl Harbor that July, Roosevelt listened to both Nimitz and MacArthur present their cases. Nimitz laid out the strategic advantages of Formosa with charts and casualty projections. MacArthur spoke of honor, of promises made to allies, of America's moral standing in the post-war world. Roosevelt watched them both, did his own political mathematics, and made his decision. MacArthur would get his return. The choice of landing site required months of analysis. Planners examined every beach, harbor, and approach in the Philippine archipelago. Luzon, the main island, offered strategic value but massive Japanese defenses. Mindanao in the south had sympathetic populations, but poor logistics. Leyte, in the central Visayas, emerged as the compromise solution. Its gulf provided protected anchorage for hundreds of ships. The invasion fleet would need sheltered water for unloading supplies over weeks or months. The island's interior offered few natural strongholds where Japanese forces could mount prolonged resistance. Most crucially, Leyte sat positioned like a dagger pointed at Manila and the central Philippines. Once secured, MacArthur's forces could strike north toward the capital or south toward the resource-rich islands with equal facility. Intelligence reported approximately 15,000 Japanese troops on Leyte, a manageable number for the assault force being assembled. What the intelligence failed to predict was Japan's response, how desperately Tokyo would fight to prevent MacArthur from making good on his promise. October 20th, 1944. Red Beach, Leyte Gulf, 0900 hours. The first landing craft ground onto the sand under a sky darkened by naval gunfire smoke. Men of the 6th Army's 24th Infantry Division waded ashore expecting hell. They'd been briefed on minefields, pillboxes, machine gun nests dug into the coconut groves behind the beach. Instead, they encountered scattered resistance. Rifle fire, some mortar rounds, nothing like the apocalyptic defenses at Tarawa or Saipan. By 1000 hours, 6,000 troops had landed. By noon, 16,000. The invasion proceeded with almost eerie smoothness, engineers bulldozing supply roads while infantry pushed inland. Then, at 1300 hours, a landing craft approached Red Beach, carrying passengers who weren't scheduled on any manifest. Douglas MacArthur had insisted on landing with the first waves. His staff had argued against it, citing security risks, but MacArthur wouldn't be denied his moment. The water came up to his knees, then his thighs as he stepped off the ramp. Behind him, photographers and newsreel cameramen captured every step. MacArthur had timed the landing for maximum dramatic effect. The tide was higher than necessary, forcing him to wade through surf that soaked his khaki trousers. He walked steadily toward the beach, his face set in that familiar expression of stern determination, seemingly oblivious to the occasional rifle shot cracking overhead. Staff officers splashed alongside him, Filipino President Sergio Osmeña struggling through the water in his wake. When MacArthur reached dry sand, he walked directly to a radio jeep where a microphone had been set up. He didn't pause to catch his breath or wring water from his uniform. He simply began speaking, his voice carrying the weight of 30 months' obsession. Finally fulfilled, people of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil. Rally to me. Let the indomitable spirit of Bataan and Corregidor lead on. The cameras caught everything. MacArthur striding from the sea like some military Neptune. The determination in his jaw. The theatrical perfection of the moment. Within days, the images appeared in newspapers across America, in newsreels playing in every cinema. The promise made in darkness on Corregidor had been kept in brilliant tropical sunshine on Leyte. But what millions watching those films didn't know, what MacArthur himself didn't yet understand, was that his return had triggered something catastrophic in Tokyo. The Japanese High Command viewed the Philippines as the linchpin of their entire southern empire. Lose the Philippines and oil from the Dutch East Indies couldn't reach Japan. Lose the Philippines and the war was effectively lost. They would throw everything they had left at Leyte Gulf, including their entire surviving fleet, in one massive desperate gamble. MacArthur had returned, exactly as promised. But the battle to make that return permanent, the largest naval engagement in human history, was about to begin in the waters around him, and its outcome was far from certain. June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea, 200 miles west of Saipan. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vrachu climbed away from the carrier USS Lexington at 14,000 feet, his F-6F Hellcat responding smoothly to every control input. Below him, the Pacific stretched away in every direction, beautiful and empty under the morning sun. His radio crackled with vectors from the fighter director officer, Japanese aircraft inbound, many aircraft bearing 270. Vrachu advanced his throttle and turned toward the contact, expecting the usual handful of enemy bombers with fighter escort. Then he saw them, a formation so vast it looked like a locust swarm, easily 50 planes in his immediate view with more behind them, all heading toward the American carriers. He dove into the formation and began shooting. In 8 minutes, Vrachu would shoot down 6 Japanese aircraft. Around him, hundreds of other American pilots were doing the same, turning the sky into what would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The slaughter that revealed Japan's naval air power had become hollow, that the elite pilots who'd struck Pearl Harbor were dead or grounded, replaced by boys who'd barely learned to fly. The battle lasted 2 days and destroyed the Japanese carrier force as an effective fighting arm. Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa had launched 4 waves totaling 428 aircraft from his carriers, confident that his pilots would cripple the American invasion fleet off Saipan. Instead, American radar detected the incoming raids 60 miles out, giving Hellcat fighters time to climb to altitude and position themselves perfectly. Japanese pilots flew straight into prepared defenses, more than 300 aircraft shot down during June 19th alone, their pilots killed or forced to ditch in the ocean. The Americans lost 29 planes. When Ozawa's surviving aircraft tried to return to their carriers, American submarines had already torpedoed 2 of his flat tops, Taiho and Shokaku, sinking with hundreds of men trapped below decks. By June 21st, when American search planes finally located the retreating Japanese fleet and launched a desperate twilight strike, Ozawa had lost 3 carriers and 600 aircraft. He retreated toward Okinawa with his surviving ships, carrying only 35 operational aircraft between 4 carriers, barely enough for self-defense, nowhere near enough for offensive operations. The psychological impact in Tokyo exceeded even the material losses. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval officers had operated under what historians would later call victory disease, the assumption that Japanese fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages, that superior training and warrior ethos rendered American numerical advantages irrelevant. The Marianas disaster shattered that delusion. Staff officers studying the battle reports couldn't deny the evidence. American pilots with 500 hours of training were shooting down Japanese pilots with 150 hours. American radar was detecting raids before Japanese observers could see the enemy ships. American industrial capacity was launching new Essex-class carriers, while Japan struggled to repair damaged vessels. Admiral Soemu Toyota, who'd replaced Admiral Minechi Koga as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet after Koga died in a plane crash that March, faced the mathematical reality. Japan's navy was dying through attrition it couldn't replace. July 18th brought political earthquake when Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government collapsed. Tojo had led Japan since October 1941, presiding over the decision to attack Pearl Harbor and the subsequent conquests across Asia and the Pacific. Now, with Saipan fallen and American B-29s preparing to bomb Japan from newly captured bases, even Tojo's supporters recognized that his strategies had failed. General Kuniaki Koiso took over as prime minister, promising a new approach that translated into exactly what defeated militaries always promise: one decisive battle that would reverse everything. The Naval General Staff began developing plans for Sho-Go, victory operation, accepting the premise that Japan lacked resources for sustained defensive campaigns. Instead, they would husband their remaining strength, wait for the Americans to strike at a critical objective, then commit everything in one massive counterattack. If they won, the shock might force America to negotiate. If they lost, at least the fleet would die fighting rather than rusting at anchor. The fuel crisis drove Japanese strategic thinking into increasingly desperate channels. Throughout 1943, American submarines had been sinking Japanese tankers faster than shipyards could replace them. By mid-1944, Japan's oil imports from the Dutch East Indies had collapsed from 2.5 million barrels per month to 300,000, barely enough to keep the economy functioning, nowhere near enough to fuel major fleet operations. Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful battleship force, sat anchored at Linga Roads near Singapore, close to Sumatra's oil refineries, because they couldn't get fuel shipped to Japan. The combined fleet had been split in two, carriers training in the inland sea, battleships and cruisers lounging in the tropics. This dispersion meant that when the decisive battle came, Japanese forces would need time to concentrate, time the Americans might not give them. The four versions of Sho-Go reflected Japan's recognition that they couldn't predict where America would strike next. Sho-1 covered the Philippines. Sho-2 addressed threats to Formosa and the Ryukyus. Sho-3 dealt with defense of the Japanese home islands. Sho-4 handled threats to Hokkaido and the Kuriles. Each plan followed the same basic concept: use remaining carrier aircraft to attrite American forces while surface ships approached for the decisive engagement. But everyone involved understood the carriers were decoys now. The elite pilots who'd made Japanese carriers dominant in 1941 and 42 were dead, killed at Midway, at Guadalcanal, in the skies over Rabaul and Truk. Their replacements had been rushed through abbreviated training programs, learning basic flight skills but lacking the combat experience and advanced techniques that separated survivors from casualties. Ozawa's carriers after the Marianas carried barely 100 aircraft total, and most of those pilots would be dead within months. September and October 1944 passed in anxious preparation. Japanese patrol planes searched constantly for signs of American fleet movements. Signals intelligence officers monitored radio traffic, trying to predict where the blow would fall. Kurita's ships refueled and conducted gunnery drills in the protected waters around Borneo. In Tokyo, Toyota waited for clarity. Then, on October 17th, reconnaissance planes reported massive American naval activity east of the Philippines, battleships bombarding Leve's beaches, transport convoys heading west. This was it, the decisive moment. Toyota activated Sho-1 at 1400 hours on October 18th, sending encrypted orders to every command: converge on Leyte Gulf. The plan was complex, involving three separate forces approaching from different directions, relying on precise timing and coordination between commanders who hadn't trained together. It required Ozawa's carriers to draw off the American fast carriers, leaving the landing area vulnerable to Kurita's battleships. It depended on surprise, on American mistakes, on luck. Most critically, it depended on officers and men willing to sail into battles they knew they probably wouldn't survive. Admiral Mitomi Ugaki, commanding the 1st Battleship Division, wrote in his diary on October 20th, "We are doomed, I suppose." Commander Tonosuke Otani, executive officer on cruiser Kumano, told his junior officers, "We will not be coming back from this operation. Make your peace with that." Thousands of sailors wrote final letters home before departing Brunei Bay, where Kurita's force had gathered for refueling. They weren't being melodramatic, they were being realistic. The orders required them to transit 1,000 miles through waters dominated by American submarines and aircraft, then approach an invasion fleet protected by hundreds of warships and thousands of planes, then somehow survive long enough to sink the vulnerable transports before being destroyed themselves. The Naval General Staff's own projections gave the operation less than 1 chance in 5 of reaching Leyte Gulf, and virtually no chance of the ships surviving afterward. But the alternative was sitting at anchor while American forces seized the Philippines, cut off the oil supplies entirely, and methodically strangled Japan's ability to continue the war. Better to die attacking than to rust into irrelevance. The institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy made such calculations possible. Officers were trained from their academy days to view death in battle as the highest honor, to see survival as almost shameful compared to glorious sacrifice. The concept of gyokusai, shattering like a jewel, permeated military thinking: better to be destroyed completely than to surrender or retreat. This wasn't simply propaganda, it was genuine belief, reinforced through decades of education, tradition, and selective reading of Japanese history. When Toyota ordered Sho-1 executed, he wasn't commanding men to commit suicide, he was offering them the chance to die meaningfully, to participate in the decisive battle that might, however improbably, change the war's trajectory. That thousands of officers and sailors accepted this fate without protest reveals both the power of institutional indoctrination and the absolute desperation of Japan's strategic position by October 1944. But beneath the surface of willing sacrifice, doubt festered. Private diaries and post-war testimonies reveal officers who questioned the plan's logic while publicly supporting it. Many recognized that the operation's complexity made failure almost certain. Too many moving parts, too much dependence on American mistakes, too little margin for error. Some suspected that the real purpose wasn't victory, but symbolic gesture, demonstrating to the Japanese people that the Navy had fought to the end, rather than accepting defeat passively. A few even whispered about the senior officers who designed this plan while keeping their own flagships safely in Japanese waters, sending subordinates to die while they preserved their careers. These doubts remained private, unexpressed in official reports, but they would surface later, when investigating why certain commanders made the decisions they did during the battle itself. For now, as Kurita's battleships sortied from Brunei on October 22nd, heading northeast toward the Philippines, doubt was drowned beneath the noise of engines and the weight of orders that couldn't be questioned or refused. September 23, 1944, Leyte Atoll, Western Caroline Islands. Captain James Avery stood on the bridge of the destroyer USS Charles Osborne, binoculars raised, slowly panning across a sight that defied his imagination. Ships filled the lagoon in every direction. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, tankers, transports, auxiliaries. Gray hulls covering the turquoise water, until the horizon disappeared behind masts and superstructures. He'd been in the Navy since 1936, had seen major fleet operations at Guadalcanal and the Gilberts and the Marshalls, but nothing approached this concentration of naval power. Avery tried counting the vessels visible from his position, and gave up after 200, realizing he could see perhaps 1/4 of the total anchorage from his vantage point. Somewhere in this immense gathering was every operational carrier the United States Navy possessed in the Pacific, 6 fast battleships that hadn't existed 3 years earlier, cruisers whose names he barely recognized because they'd been commissioned so recently. This wasn't just a fleet. It was a demonstration of industrial capacity, so overwhelming that victory seemed mathematically inevitable, as long as someone didn't make a catastrophic mistake. The assembly of this armada had begun months earlier, coordinated through thousands of pages of operational orders typed in basement offices at Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid commanded the 7th Fleet, nicknamed MacArthur's Navy, because it reported directly to the Southwest Pacific Commander rather than to Admiral Nimitz in Hawaii. Kinkaid's responsibility was amphibious operations, landing the troops, protecting the transports, providing naval gunfire support, establishing supply lines. His fleet included 6 old battleships that had survived Pearl Harbor, now modernized and equipped for shore bombardment. 16 escort carriers, small, slow flat tops built on merchant hulls, provided air cover for the landing zones. Cruisers and destroyers by the dozen formed screening forces and bombardment groups. Then there were the 420 transport and cargo ships that would carry 174,000 troops and 235,000 tons of supplies. The 7th Fleet was built for invasion, optimized for getting soldiers ashore and keeping them supplied, less concerned with fighting enemy fleets than with supporting ground operations. Admiral William Halsey commanded the 3rd Fleet, the striking arm that reported to Nimitz and operated independently of MacArthur's ground forces. Where Kinkaid's fleet was built for support, Halsey's was built for destruction. 8 Essex-class fleet carriers, ships that hadn't existed when the war started, formed the core of his power. Each carrier operated nearly 100 aircraft, Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, Avenger torpedo planes. 8 light carriers added more air power, 6 fast battleships, Iowa, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Alabama, Indiana, Washington, provided both anti-aircraft protection and surface striking power. These weren't the old dreadnoughts from Pearl Harbor. They were modern capital ships capable of 33 knots, bristling with 5-inch dual-purpose guns and 40mm anti-aircraft weapons. 17 cruisers and 64 destroyers completed the task force, organized into 4 separate task groups that could operate independently or concentrate for major battles. Halsey's fleet existed to hunt and destroy the Japanese Navy, to clear the seas of enemy warships, so Kinkaid's vulnerable transports could operate safely. The command structure seemed logical on paper, but contained a fatal flaw that wouldn't become apparent until combat revealed it. Halsey reported to Nimitz in Pearl Harbor. Kinkaid reported to MacArthur in Brisbane. Neither admiral directly commanded the other, though they were supposed to cooperate toward common objectives. In practice, this meant 2 separate chains of command converging on the same operational area, the waters around Leyte Gulf, without a single unified commander making tactical decisions. The arrangement had worked during previous operations because the objectives were simple and enemy opposition limited. But against a coordinated Japanese counterattack involving multiple forces approaching from different directions, the divided command structure would prove nearly catastrophic. For now, though, as both fleets steamed toward the Philippines, the admirals communicated cordially through radio messages and staff conferences, each confident they understood the other's intentions and responsibilities. The logistical achievement behind this fleet deployment exceeded even the ships themselves. Every vessel required fuel, oil, aviation gasoline, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, lubricants, and dozens of other essentials. The carrier USS Essex alone needed 150,000 gallons of aviation gasoline for a week's operations, plus hundreds of bombs, thousands of rounds of ammunition, replacement aircraft, and supplies for 3,000 crew members. Multiply that across 8 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, then add the destroyers burning fuel oil at prodigious rates, while screening at high speed, the battleships carrying 16-inch shells weighing more than a ton each, the cruisers firing 6-inch and 8-inch projectiles by the hundreds. The United States Navy had developed an entire auxiliary fleet of oilers, ammunition ships, store ships, and repair vessels that could replenish warships at sea, allowing the fleet to operate thousands of miles from any base for weeks at a time. Japanese planners looked at this mobile logistics capability with despair. They'd never developed anything comparable, forcing their ships to return to base regularly for refueling and rearming. The invasion plan called for a 3-day preliminary bombardment before the actual landings. Starting October 17th, American battleships and cruisers would pound Leyte's beaches and coastal defenses, destroying bunkers and gun positions, cratering any potential obstacles. Minesweepers would clear approach channels under fire, marking safe passages for the landing craft. Underwater demolition teams, the forerunners of modern Navy SEALs, would swim to the beaches at night, blowing up obstacles and reconnoitering the terrain. Only after 3 days of preparation would the actual assault waves land. This methodical approach reflected lessons learned through bloody experience at Tarawa, where Marines had landed on an inadequately bombarded beach and suffered terrible casualties. Leyte would receive overwhelming preliminary fire, enough to suppress any defenders and give the first waves maximum chance of getting ashore without catastrophic losses. October 17th arrived with cloudy skies and moderate seas. At 0600 hours, the old battleships USS West Virginia, California, and Tennessee opened fire from 10,000 yards offshore. Their 14-inch guns hurled high-explosive shells onto beaches and supply dumps, each round creating a mushroom cloud of dirt and smoke. Cruisers added 8-inch and 6-inch fire, walking their salvos across suspected defensive positions. The bombardment continued for 3 days, pausing only for aircraft to drop bombs on targets farther inland. Pilots reported surprisingly light anti-aircraft fire. Japanese forces on Leyte seemed to be conserving ammunition, not firing unless targets approached their positions directly. Intelligence officers noted this in their reports but didn't understand what it signified. The Japanese garrison was smaller than estimated, and they were planning to defend inland rather than at the beaches, letting the Americans come ashore before fighting. This would make the invasion easier, but the follow-on campaign bloodier. October 20th dawned with perfect invasion weather, calm seas, scattered clouds, excellent visibility. At 0600 hours, the first landing craft loaded with infantry began circling in assembly areas offshore. Each boat carried about 30 men, packed shoulder to shoulder with rifles held vertically, life belts strapped tight, faces showing that mixture of boredom and terror, common to soldiers waiting for combat. Some vomited over the side from seasickness or fear. Others smoked nervously, ignoring regulations against open flames near fuel tanks. A few prayed silently while most simply waited, thinking about home or trying not to think at all. At 0930 hours, the bombardment lifted. At 0945, the first wave crossed the line of departure and headed toward Red Beach. 15 minutes later, at exactly 1000 hours, H hour, landing craft ground onto the sand and their ramps dropped. The invasion of Leyte had begun, and offshore 738 American ships waited to support it. But even as troops established their beachhead and MacArthur staged his dramatic wade ashore, something else was moving toward Leyte Gulf. Japanese patrol planes had spotted the American fleet days earlier. Admiral Toyota in Tokyo had activated Sho-1, three separate Japanese forces were converging on the Philippines from different directions. Kurida's powerful center force with 5 battleships including the giants Yamato and Musashi, Nishimura's southern force approaching through the southern islands, and far to the north, Admiral Ozawa's carriers steaming south with nearly empty decks, hoping to draw Halsey away from Leyte. The largest naval battle in history was about to begin, and the 738 ships anchored in Leyte Gulf, many of them thin-skinned transports filled with ammunition and fuel, represented the prize both sides would fight to protect or destroy. The American sailors who'd assembled this unprecedented armada didn't yet know they were about to face the Imperial Japanese Navy's last desperate gamble, didn't know that command confusion and tactical errors would bring Japanese battleships within shooting distance of defenseless troopships. They would learn soon enough. The evening of October 20th passed quietly aboard most American ships. Sailors ate dinner in mess decks, wrote letters home, played cards or read magazines, went through the routines that made Navy life bearable. Some watched the tropical sunset paint the sky orange and purple above the silhouettes of mountains on Leyte. Others stood watch on gun mounts or in engine rooms, maintaining the vigilance that kept ships combat ready. In flag plot aboard USS New Jersey, Admiral Halsey studied intelligence reports about possible Japanese fleet movements, but nothing definite, nothing requiring immediate action. Aboard USS Wasatch, Admiral Kinkaid reviewed unloading schedules and casualty reports from the day's fighting. Lighter than expected, only modest resistance encountered so far. Neither admiral knew that in the Sibuyan Sea, 200 miles to the west, Japanese battleships were approaching at 20 knots. Neither knew that American submarines had already detected them and were maneuvering for attack. The Great Steel Collision was hours away from beginning, and when it started, it would reveal just how much could go wrong, even when you commanded the largest fleet ever assembled. October 18, 1944. Flag Bridge, Carrier Zuikaku, Inland Sea. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood watching the morning sun rise over Shikoku Island, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that concealed their slight trembling. At 58 years old, he'd spent 4 decades in the Imperial Navy, rising through cruiser commands to become one of Japan's most respected carrier admirals. Now he commanded a carrier force that existed in name only. Zuikaku, his flagship, was the last surviving carrier from the 6 that had struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, all sunk at Midway in June 42. Shikoku torpedoed by an American submarine in June 44, during the Marianas disaster. Only Zuikaku remained, and she carried just 29 aircraft on decks designed for 75. The other 3 carriers of his force, Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, together carried 79 more aircraft, 108 aircraft total across 4 carriers. Ozawa knew American carriers each operated 80 to 100 planes. He knew the Fast Carrier Task Force, hunting for him, probably had 16 carriers and over 1,000 aircraft. His orders were simple and suicidal. Sail south, attract American attention, draw the enemy carriers away from Leyte Gulf so Kurida's battleships could attack the invasion fleet. Die so others might succeed. The plan had a name that captured its desperation: Shoichi-go. Victory Plan Number 1. Admiral Toyota had conceived it in conferences during September, refining details through October as intelligence confirmed the Americans were preparing for a major offensive. The concept acknowledged reality. Japan's Navy couldn't win a conventional fleet engagement anymore. Too many carriers sunk, too many pilots killed, too few replacement aircraft, fuel shortages forcing ships to anchor near refineries, rather than train together as a fleet. But Japan still possessed powerful battleships, and battleships could destroy thin-skinned transports and cargo ships if they could reach the vulnerable invasion fleet. The Americans would protect those transports with their carriers. Carriers were the dominant weapon now. Everyone accepted that, so the solution was to separate the American carriers from their transports, to lure them away with a tempting target, giving the battleships time to slip through and attack the helpless supply vessels. Ozawa's force was that tempting target. His carriers were bait, and everyone from Toyota in Tokyo to the youngest pilot aboard Zuikaku understood this. The orders acknowledged it explicitly. The mission of main body is to decoy the enemy carrier force, not attack, not defeat, not damage. Decoy. Lead them away. Buy time. Survive as long as possible while accomplishing the mission. but survival was optional. What mattered was drawing Admiral Halsey north, while Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita approached from the west. The plan required Kurita's center force to transit more than 500 miles of Philippine waters, exposed to air attack and submarine assault for 2 full days before reaching Leyte Gulf. Kurita needed those 2 days without American carrier strikes. Ozawa's job was to make sure he got them, whatever the cost to Ozawa's own command. The center force represented Japan's remaining battleship strength, concentrated into a single powerful fist. Kurita commanded 5 battleships, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, 72,000-ton monsters carrying 18.1-inch guns that could hurl 3,200-pound shells over 26 miles. No ship ever built had heavier armor or bigger guns. The American IOS were magnificent vessels, but Yamato and Musashi exceeded them in every dimension except speed. 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers completed Kurita's force. 32 warships carrying enough firepower to obliterate everything in Leyte Gulf if they could reach it. The route took them through San Bernardino Strait, the narrow passage separating Luzon from Samar, then south along Samar's coast to the invasion anchorage. Narrow waters, perfect for submarine ambush. Daylight transits, perfect for air attack. But it was the most direct route, and time mattered. The invasion had already begun, and every hour's delay gave the Americans time to unload supplies and reinforce their positions. A second force approached from the south. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura commanding 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers through Surigao Strait, the passage separating Leyte from Mindanao. Nishimura's was the smallest of the 3 Japanese forces, but his route was also the most direct. If Kurita and Nishimura both reached Leyte Gulf simultaneously from different directions, the American defenders would face attacks from 2 sides, dividing their forces and attention. A third force under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima followed Nishimura through the southern approach, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 4 destroyers. Shima reported directly to the Naval General Staff rather than to Kurita, which meant his force operated independently, supposedly coordinating with Nishimura, but not under his command. This divided authority would prove problematic, but Japanese institutional culture made it impossible to resolve. Neither commander would subordinate himself to the other, and Tokyo lacked time to argue. The entire plan depended on Ozawa succeeding at his mission, yet Ozawa faced a nearly impossible problem: how to make his force visible to the Americans. Carriers were valuable targets, but Halsey wouldn't chase empty carriers deep into the Philippine Sea unless he knew they were there. Japanese doctrine emphasized radio silence. Warships approaching combat zones maintained communication security, avoiding transmissions that enemy direction-finding equipment could detect. Ozawa had to violate that doctrine deliberately, making his fleet as obvious as possible while not making the deception too transparent. Starting October 23rd, Ozawa's radio operators began transmitting frequent messages in codes they knew the Americans had broken: weather reports, position updates, tactical queries to shore bases. Anything to generate electronic signatures that American listening posts would detect and relay to fleet headquarters. On October 24th, Ozawa made his boldest move. He launched an airstrike toward Luzon, with the specific intent of being detected. 76 aircraft departed his 4 carriers in the morning, most piloted by men who'd never flown combat missions before, heading south toward American positions with orders to attack if they found targets, but primarily to be seen. American radar detected them 100 miles out. Fighter directors vectored Hellcats to intercept. The green Japanese pilots stumbled into prepared defenses and died. Only 29 aircraft returned to Ozawa's carriers. But the sacrifice accomplished its purpose. Now the Americans knew Japanese carriers were north of Luzon. Now Halsey would face a choice: continue supporting the invasion or turn north to destroy the last remaining Japanese flat tops. Ozawa had dangled the bait convincingly, demonstrated that his carriers were actively operating, made himself too tempting to ignore. The human cost of this plan was rarely discussed in official orders, but every man sailing with Ozawa or Kurita or Nishimura understood he probably wouldn't survive. Young officers wrote final letters home before departing Brunei and the inland sea. Sailors bundled their personal effects with instructions for forwarding to families. Buddhist priests conducted services aboard several ships, blessing crews about to sail into battles they expected to lose. This wasn't defeatism, it was realism. combined with acceptance. Japanese military culture had prepared these men for exactly this moment, teaching them that death in service to the emperor represented the highest possible honor. The concept was called giretsu, combining duty, loyalty, and honor into a willingness to sacrifice everything for the collective good. When Ozawa's chief of staff privately expressed doubts about the plan's success, Ozawa replied simply, "We are expendable. What matters is whether our sacrifice buys time for Kurita." October 21st, 1900 hours. Tsukikaku's radio room received Toyota's execute order. Sho-1 authorized, all forces proceed as planned. Ozawa immediately ordered his force to sail, heading south from the inland sea toward Luzon. The 4 carriers, 2 hybrid battleship carriers, 3 cruisers, and 8 destroyers departed in the twilight, their wakes glowing with phosphorescence as they cleared the Japanese home islands, for what most men aboard expected was the last time. In the Sibuyan Sea, Kurita's center force was already steaming toward San Bernardino Strait, having departed Brunei Bay the previous day. Hundreds of miles south, Nishimura entered the Sulu Sea, approaching Surigao Strait from the west. The 3 forces would reach their operating areas on October 25th, if everything went according to schedule. They wouldn't coordinate directly. Radio silence prevented detailed tactical communications, but theoretically, they'd converge on Leyte Gulf simultaneously, overwhelming the defenses through multiple simultaneous threats. Theory and reality rarely align in warfare, especially in plans requiring precise timing across vast distances without reliable communications. Ozawa's plan assumed Kurita would reach San Bernardino Strait undetected, or at least without being delayed significantly by American submarines or aircraft. It assumed Halsey would take the bait and chase carriers, rather than guard the strait. It assumed Nishimura could transit Surigao Strait despite it being an obvious approach route that the Americans would almost certainly defend. It assumed coordination between forces that couldn't talk to each other, and whose commanders had never trained together for this specific operation. Most fundamentally, it assumed that even if everything went perfectly, and Kurita's battleships reached Leyte Gulf, they could inflict enough damage before being destroyed to justify the entire combined fleet's suicide. None of these assumptions would prove valid, but as Ozawa's carriers sailed south through darkness, none of the men aboard knew that yet. They knew only that they were bait in a trap, and traps work only if the prey takes the bait willingly. October 20th, 1944, Red Beach, Leyte Gulf, 1000 hours. Private First Class Eugene Sledge crouched in the bottom of the landing craft as it churned toward the beach, his rifle held tight against his chest, seawater spraying over the gunwales to soak everyone aboard. Around him, 30 other Marines from Co Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Regiment, sat shoulder to shoulder, faces showing that peculiar expression of men waiting to discover if they would live or die. The coxswain opened the throttle wider, and the boat surged forward, engine roaring, the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with salt spray, and the acrid tang of naval gunfire smoke that hung like fog across the water. Sledge had been told to expect hell. Pillboxes firing from the tree line, mortar rounds exploding in the surf, machine guns cutting down the first waves before they reached dry sand. Instead, when the ramp dropped at exactly 1000 hours and men stumbled forward into knee-deep water, they encountered scattered rifle fire and a few mortar rounds, nothing like the apocalyptic defenses at Peleliu, where Sledge had watched friends die by the hundreds. Within 15 minutes, K Company was off the beach and moving inland through coconut groves, and behind them, more landing craft were arriving in an endless stream, disgorging thousands of men onto Philippine soil. The invasion proceeded with almost mechanical precision, the product of 2 years' hard learning through blood and failure. At Tarawa, planners had underestimated tides and Marines had drowned, trying to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water under fire. At Saipan, confusion in landing zones had created bottlenecks where men bunched up and became easy targets. Leyte incorporated every lesson purchased with casualties, accurate tide tables, sufficient landing craft, detailed beach reconnaissance, overwhelming preliminary bombardment. By noon on October 20th, 16,000 troops were ashore. By sunset, 60,000. Engineers bulldozed supply roads through the sand. Shore parties established ammunition dumps and fuel depots. Artillery battalions dragged their guns inland and began registering targets. The 6th Army's 24th Infantry Division pushed east toward Tacloban, encountering light resistance from Japanese rearguards who fired a few shots and withdrew rather than defending fixed positions. The light opposition puzzled intelligence officers. Estimates had projected 15,000 Japanese troops on Leyte, organized into the 16th Division under Lieutenant General Shiro Makino. Interrogation of the few prisoners captured during the first day revealed that most of the division had deployed inland to the mountains, planning to defend from prepared positions rather than fighting on the beaches where American naval gunfire could destroy them. This was different from Japanese doctrine on previous islands, where fanatical beach defense had been standard. The shift suggested either a change in Japanese thinking or specific characteristics of Leyte's terrain. The island's interior offered jungles and mountains perfect for defensive warfare, while the coastal plains provided little cover for defenders against naval bombardment. Whatever the reason, the lighter beach resistance meant the invasion's initial phase would cost fewer casualties than feared, though it also meant the Japanese garrison remained intact and dangerous, waiting inland. 1,300 hours brought theater to the invasion. Word spread through the units ashore that General MacArthur was landing, not scheduled to arrive until the beachhead was secured, but arriving now while occasional mortar rounds still fell on Red Beach and snipers fired from the coconut palms. Men watched as a landing craft approached, its ramp dropping in waist-deep water. MacArthur stepped off wearing his signature sunglasses and khaki uniform with no helmet, striding through the surf with absolute confidence while staff officers splashed alongside him and photographers captured everything. The general had timed his arrival precisely. The water was deep enough to create dramatic images of him wading ashore, but not so deep as to be dangerous. The beach was secure enough to be relatively safe, but not so secure as to lack drama. He walked directly to a microphone set up on the beach and delivered the words he'd been preparing for 30 months. "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The broadcast went out immediately over Armed Forces radio, transmitted throughout the islands and across the Pacific. In Manila, Filipino civilians huddled around hidden radios, wept at hearing MacArthur's voice. In mountain camps, guerrilla fighters cheered and prepared for open warfare against the Japanese occupation. In Washington, Roosevelt's advisors noted with satisfaction that the dramatic landing would play well in newsreels, helpful for the upcoming election. MacArthur's critics, and he had many among Navy officers, saw shameless self-promotion, a general staging photo opportunities while real soldiers fought and died. But MacArthur understood something about morale and politics that pure military professionals sometimes missed. Symbols matter, theater matters. The perception of victory can be as important as victory itself. His wade through the surf would become one of the war's iconic images, reproduced in newspapers and magazines, helping justify the strategic decision to invade the Philippines rather than bypassing them for Formosa. While MacArthur delivered his speech and photographers clicked their cameras, the actual work of invasion continued around them. Leyte Gulf filled with ships throughout the afternoon, transports anchoring to unload supplies, cargo vessels swinging cargo nets over their sides to transfer crates into lighters, tankers pumping fuel oil into smaller boats for distribution ashore. The anchorage extended for miles, hundreds of vessels packed into the protected waters between Leyte and Samar. Each transport carried ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, spare parts, construction equipment, and all the material required to sustain 60,000 men in combat. The unloading process would take days under the best circumstances, maybe weeks if Japanese air attacks or naval interference disrupted operations. Those vulnerable cargo ships and transports represented the entire logistical foundation of MacArthur's Philippines campaign. Destroy them and the Sixth Army would be stranded, unable to advance or possibly even survive without resupply from rear bases hundreds of miles away. Security for this massive vulnerable fleet fell to Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet. The 6 old battleships, West Virginia, California, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, anchored near Surigao Strait's northern entrance, positioned to block any Japanese surface forces attempting to approach from the south. 16 escort carriers, small, slow flat tops nicknamed Jeep carriers or baby flat tops, provided air cover, their aircraft patrolling constantly for incoming raids. Cruisers and destroyers formed anti-submarine screens, hunting with sonar for any underwater threats. The defensive arrangements looked adequate on paper, organized into task units with specific responsibilities and patrol areas. But those arrangements assumed the main threat would come from aircraft or submarines, not from major surface forces. They assumed Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet would remain nearby to intercept any Japanese battleships or heavy cruisers before they reached Leyte Gulf. They assumed coordination between Halsey and Kinkaid would prevent any gaps in coverage. Evening brought the first fragmentary intelligence suggesting those assumptions might be wrong. Radio intercept stations detected increased Japanese naval communications, suggesting fleet movements, but without clear indicators of direction or strength. Patrol aircraft reported possible ship contacts in the Sulu Sea and west of the Philippines, but cloud cover prevented definite identification. More concerning, submarine reports began filtering in from the Palawan Passage and Mindoro Strait. Major Japanese warships heading northeast toward the Philippines, including what one submarine identified as battleships, battleships. The reports were fragmentary, decoded slowly, forwarded through channels that took hours. By the time senior officers saw consolidated intelligence, the picture was unclear. Something was happening, Japanese naval forces were moving, but exactly what forces and toward what objectives remained uncertain. Aboard USS Wasatch, Admiral Kinkaid reviewed the intelligence with his staff, trying to assess threat levels. His responsibility was protecting the invasion fleet, but his offensive capabilities were limited. The old battleships were perfect for shore bombardment, but slow and lacking modern fire control for ship-to-ship combat. The escort carriers could launch aircraft, but carried fighters and light bombers, designed for ground support, not anti-ship strikes with heavy ordnance. If Japanese battleships actually approached Leyte Gulf, Kinkaid would need help from Halsey's Third Fleet with its fast carriers and modern battleships. He drafted a message to Halsey, requesting confirmation that the Third Fleet would cover San Bernardino Strait, the most direct approach from the west. The message went out at 2100 hours. Query, is Task Force 34 guarding San Bernardino Strait? The question hung unanswered as night fell over Leyte Gulf. Aboard hundreds of ships, sailors stood watches or tried to sleep in crowded compartments, unaware that three separate Japanese forces were converging on their position. Kurita's center force was approaching San Bernardino Strait from the west, with 5 battleships including Yamato and Musashi. Nishimura's southern force was entering the Sulu Sea, heading for Surigao Strait. Far to the north, Ozawa's carriers were steaming south, preparing to reveal themselves and draw Halsey away. The stage was set for history's largest naval battle, and the Americans anchored in Leyte Gulf, protecting transports filled with ammunition and fuel, represented the prize both sides would fight to defend or destroy. Private Sledge and his fellow Marines had no idea about the naval maneuvering happening offshore. They dug foxholes in the sandy soil behind Red Beach, established perimeter defenses, ate cold rations, and tried to rest before whatever combat tomorrow would bring. A few noticed increased radio traffic among Navy units, more patrol boats than usual motoring around the anchorage, but most were too exhausted to wonder about it. They'd landed successfully. MacArthur had returned. The invasion was proceeding well. What else mattered? They didn't know that success depended on warships they couldn't see, commanded by admirals who didn't fully communicate with each other, defending against threats that intelligence had only partially identified. They didn't know that in approximately 60 hours, Japanese battleships would come within shooting distance of defenseless transports, and only a desperate last stand by destroyers and escort carriers would prevent catastrophe. For now, on the evening of October 20th, they simply slept in their foxholes while tropical rain began falling, and offshore, the massive American fleet swung at anchor, waiting. October 23, 1944, Palawan Passage, 0100 hours. Commander David McClintock stood in the conning tower of USS Darter, studying the radar scope's green glow with increasing excitement. The PPI display showed multiple contacts bearing 275 degrees, range 16,000 yards, heading northeast at approximately 18 knots. Too many contacts for a convoy. At least 12 major ships, probably more. McClintock had been patrolling this area for 3 days, part of a submarine wolf pack positioned to intercept any Japanese fleet units departing the southern anchorages. Now something big was heading his way, transiting the narrow passage between Palawan Island and the dangerous ground, a 20-mile-wide channel that funneled shipping into predictable tracks. He keyed the intercom to the radio room. "Get me Dace. Tell Commander Claggett we have multiple heavy contacts. Looks like a major surface force." Then to his plotting team, "Start the attack. We're going to get ahead of them and wait for daylight." USS Dace, McClintock's partner submarine, was patrolling 15 miles northeast. Commander Bladen Claggett received Darter's contact report within minutes and immediately began maneuvering to intercept. The two submarines had trained together, hunted together, and now they would attack together, using tactics perfected through 2 years of Pacific submarine operations. The plan was simple: surface during darkness to achieve maximum speed, race ahead of the Japanese formation, submerge before dawn, position for point-blank torpedo shots as the enemy passed overhead. American submarines in 1944 bore little resemblance to the boats that had started the war. The torpedo problems that had plagued operations through 1942, duds, premature explosions, depth-keeping failures, were finally solved. Radar gave submarines targeting information even in darkness. Most critically, American skippers had abandoned peacetime caution and adopted aggressive tactics that took full advantage of their boats' capabilities. Both submarines surfaced and began the chase. Diesel engines roaring, making better than 20 knots on the calm sea. They raced northeast while tracking the Japanese formation on radar. McClintock estimated they needed 3 hours to get ahead, far enough for a submerged attack at dawn. The risk was substantial. If Japanese radar detected them, or if patrol aircraft spotted their wakes, destroyers would swarm them before they could dive. But the potential reward justified the risk. The radar contacts were too large and too numerous to be anything except major warships, cruisers at minimum, possibly battleships. This was exactly the kind of target American submarines dreamed about, exactly why they patrolled these waters, enduring heat and boredom and periodic terror. At 0300 hours, both submarines were in position. At 0415, they submerged to periscope depth and waited. Dawn came slowly, the darkness fading to gray, then gradually brightening as the sun rose behind Palawan. Through Darter's periscope, McClintock watched the horizon, waiting. Then he saw them, pagoda masts rising above the horizon, the distinctive silhouettes of Japanese heavy cruisers, followed by the massive superstructures of battleships. 5 battleships, he counted them carefully, identifying the lead pair as the super battleships Yamato and Musashi from their enormous beam and height. 12 cruisers, heavy and light, 15 destroyers. This was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the most powerful Japanese fleet formation remaining in the Pacific, heading toward San Bernardino Strait and ultimately toward Leyte Gulf. McClintock studied the formation through his periscope, noting the 4-column formation with screening destroyers ahead and on the flanks. The second column from the left consisted entirely of heavy cruisers, perfect torpedo targets. At 0524 hours, McClintock gave the order: make ready all tubes. Stand by for surface attack. Darter's crew had drilled this evolution hundreds of times. Torpedomen flooded the tubes. The fire control party calculated target speed, angle, and range. McClintock kept his periscope trained on the nearest heavy cruiser, watching it grow larger as ranges closed. At 4,000 yards, he could see details: men on the bridge, anti-aircraft guns, the cruiser's wake creaming white. The target was Atago, Kurita's flagship, carrying the admiral and his entire staff. McClintock didn't know the cruiser's identity or that the admiral was aboard, but he recognized it as the formation leader and therefore the highest value target. At 0532 hours, range 3,000 yards, he gave the command: Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4, Fire 5, Fire 6. 6 Mark 14 torpedoes erupted from Darter's tubes at 3-second intervals, their wakeless electric motors driving them toward Atago at 46 knots. McClintock counted seconds in his head: 45, 46, 47. Then, the first explosion, a massive detonation that sent a column of water skyward alongside Atago's hull. Second explosion, third, fourth. 4 torpedoes out of 6 had hit, striking below the waterline where Atago's armor was thinnest, blowing enormous holes in her side. Through the periscope, McClintock watched Atago lurch to port, saw smoke and steam venting from ruptured compartments, saw men running on deck. The cruiser was dying. Anyone with submarine experience could recognize the signs. He swung his periscope to the next target, heavy cruiser Takao, and fired 4 more torpedoes. 2 hit Takao's stern, wrecking her propellers and rudder, stopping her dead in the water. 15 miles northeast, Commander Claggett aboard Dace watched the chaos through his own periscope. The Japanese formation had dissolved into confusion. destroyers racing around looking for submarines, cruisers turning hard to avoid torpedoes, the entire neat procession becoming a chaotic scramble. Claggett saw his own opportunity. Heavy cruiser Maya breaking away from the formation, presenting a perfect broadside target. He fired 4 torpedoes at 2,000 yards range. All 4 hit Maya amidships in a cluster, the detonations occurring so close together they sounded like one massive explosion. Maya's back broke, the cruiser jackknifed, bow and stern rising while the center section sank, and within 4 minutes the entire ship had disappeared beneath the surface, taking over 1,000 men with her. Aboard Otago, Admiral Kurita faced catastrophe. His flagship was sinking beneath him, listing heavily to port, all electrical power lost, communications dead. He'd been in his sea cabin when the torpedoes hit, the explosions throwing him against the bulkhead hard enough to bruise ribs. Now he stood on the bridge wing, watching water rise up Otago's side, knowing she would capsize within minutes. The order to abandon ship was unnecessary. Everyone could see the cruiser was doomed. Men jumped into the oil-covered water, swimming away from the sinking hull. Kurita removed his boots and followed them, entering the warm water and swimming through floating debris. Destroyers raced in to pick up survivors, their sailors throwing lines and cargo nets over the side. A destroyer hauled Kurita aboard, but his ordeal wasn't over. Otago carried all his charts, his communication codes, his staff officers, and their carefully prepared operation plans. Most of those officers drowned when Otago capsized and sank 19 minutes after the first torpedo hit. The submarine attack had lasted 30 minutes and cost Kurita 20% of his cruiser strength before he'd even entered Philippine waters. 2 heavy cruisers sunk, Otago and Maya, with 1,620 men killed. Takao crippled, forced to return to Brunei with 2 destroyers escorting. Kurita himself swimming in oil-covered water, then transferring from the rescue destroyer to battleship Yamato to re-establish his command, a process that took hours. His entire staff structure was disrupted. Key officers dead, charts lost, communication procedures compromised. The psychological impact exceeded even the material losses. Kurita had nearly drowned. He'd watched his flagship sink. He'd spent hours reorganizing his command while his force continued northeast toward American air bases, approaching the range where carrier aircraft could strike. The submarine attacks demonstrated technological and tactical evolution that Japanese anti-submarine doctrine hadn't kept pace with. American radar could detect surface ships at ranges where Japanese lookouts saw nothing. American torpedoes worked reliably after the fixes implemented in late 1943. American submarine tactics emphasized aggressive surface approaches and point-blank firing ranges that maximized hit probability. Japanese escorts still used depth charges rather than the ahead-throwing weapons American and British navies had developed, meaning submarines that dove deep could often escape. The combined fleet had built its doctrine around battleship and carrier actions, treating submarines as auxiliary weapons for reconnaissance and commerce raiding. Now they were learning that submarines could ambush and cripple major fleet units before surface action even began. McClintock and Claggett had proven that lesson definitively. After their attacks, both submarines went deep to evade the frantic depth charging by Japanese destroyers. Darter eventually surfaced after dark, only to run hard aground on Bombay Shoal, trying to maneuver for another attack on the crippled Takao. McClintock was forced to abandon his submarine, transferring his entire crew to Dace, while Darter's crew set demolition charges to prevent their boat from being captured. But the mission was accomplished. They detected Kurita's force, reported its composition and course, and sunk or damaged 3 major warships before the main battle even began. Their contact reports reached Admiral Halsey aboard New Jersey within hours, giving American commanders their first definite intelligence about Japanese movements. Kurita was coming, heading for San Bernardino Strait, wounded but still dangerous. The question was what the American fleet would do about it. October 24, 1944, Sibuyan Sea, 0800 hours. The morning sun painted Musashi's gray hull with golden light as the super battleship steamed northeast through waters, so calm they looked like glass. On the bridge, Captain Toshihei Inoguchi stood studying the horizon with binoculars, searching for the aircraft he knew would come. Musashi was the largest battleship ever constructed, 72,000 tons fully loaded, 863 feet long, carrying 9 18.1-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing 3,200 pounds over 26 miles. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick, turret faces 26 inches, designed to survive 20 torpedo hits or multiple large-caliber shell strikes. Naval architects had proclaimed her unsinkable. Inoguchi, who'd commanded her since November 1943, knew better. No ship was truly unsinkable if you put enough explosives into her, and American carrier aircraft could deliver enormous amounts of explosive ordnance. The question wasn't whether they would attack, but how many aircraft would come, and whether Musashi's guns could shoot down enough of them before the torpedoes and bombs overwhelmed her defenses. The answer appeared at 0830 hours, when lookouts reported aircraft approaching from the east. Many aircraft flying in formation at high altitude. Inoguchi ordered battle stations. Throughout Musashi, 2,400 men ran to their posts. Main battery turrets trained out, though 18-inch guns were useless against aircraft. Secondary batteries, 6-inch guns and 4 turrets, elevated to maximum angle. Anti-aircraft crews manned 125mm guns and 25mm machine cannons that studded the superstructure like deadly flowers. The ship's 24 5-inch guns, mounted in 12 twin turrets, would bear the primary air defense burden. Deep in the hull, damage control parties closed watertight doors and tested pumps. In the engine rooms, engineers monitored boilers and turbines that could drive Musashi to 27.5 knots. Everything aboard the battleship was functioning perfectly. Every system ready, every man at his station. It wouldn't be enough. The first wave arrived at 10:30 hours. 45 aircraft from carrier USS Intrepid, diving and releasing torpedoes and bombs through a sky turned black by Musashi's anti-aircraft fire. The battleship's guns created a wall of steel and explosive, 5-inch shells bursting in white puffs, tracers from machine cannons weaving patterns of light, the noise so intense that men screamed orders and couldn't hear their own voices. Aircraft fell, Avengers tumbling into the sea trailing smoke, Helldivers disintegrating under direct hits, but some got through. One torpedo struck Musashi's bow, the detonation sending a shudder through the entire ship. One bomb penetrated the weather deck and exploded inside, killing 30 men instantly. Damage control parties rushed to contain flooding in the forward compartments. Inoguchi assessed the damage, serious but manageable. Musashi's speed dropped slightly to 22 knots, but she remained combat effective. The second wave came at noon, 50 aircraft from carriers, Essex and Lexington. This time the attackers coordinated better, torpedo planes hitting from both sides simultaneously to split the defensive fire. 3 torpedoes struck Musashi's port side within 30 seconds, each detonation blowing a hole large enough to drive a truck through. 3 bombs hit topside, one penetrating deep into the ship before exploding, devastating the crew quarters. Musashi developed a 5-degree list to port, counter-flooding, deliberately flooding compartments on the starboard side to correct the list, restored some stability, but now water was pouring into the ship from 6 major holes below the waterline. Pumps ran continuously, barely keeping pace with the flooding. The bow settled deeper, Musashi's sharp prow beginning to push water aside rather than cutting through it cleanly. Speed dropped to 18 knots. At 13:30 hours, the third wave attacked. 65 aircraft from 3 carriers, more planes than Musashi's guns could possibly stop. The sky filled with aircraft diving from every direction, torpedo wakes crisscrossing the water, bombs falling like deadly rain. 4 more torpedoes hit, 2 port, 2 starboard. The port side hits expanding existing damage, the starboard hits opening new wounds. 4 more bombs struck the superstructure and deck, one destroying the main fire control director, another starting fires that damage control parties couldn't contain because firefighting pumps had lost pressure from progressive flooding. Musashi listed 12 degrees to port now. Counter-flooding could no longer correct it because too many compartments were already flooded. The bow had settled so deep that waves broke over the forward deck with each swell. Speed was down to 12 knots and falling. The 4th and 5th waves came at 1,500 hours and 1,600 hours, another 100 aircraft total, attacking a crippled target that could barely maneuver. By now, Musashi's anti-aircraft ammunition was running low. Gun crews fired slower, conserving rounds, targeting only aircraft that seemed certain to hit. More torpedoes struck. The total would eventually reach 19, though no one aboard could count accurately amid the chaos. More bombs hit, eventually 17, many penetrating deep into the ship because Musashi's upward-angled deck from flooding forward made flat trajectories possible. Fires raged in multiple compartments. The forward magazines flooded to prevent explosions. All power forward was lost. The list increased to 20 degrees, enough that walking on deck required holding railings. At 16:30 hours, Captain Inoguchi faced reality. Musashi was dying. The bow was completely submerged, water reaching the forward turret. Pumps had lost their battle hours ago. Water was entering the ship faster than any pumping system could remove it. The list was increasing despite all counter-flooding efforts. Calculations showed the ship would capsize within hours, maybe less. Inoguchi ordered all non-essential personnel to abandon ship, but he and 400 officers and senior petty officers would stay aboard, trying to beach Musashi on a nearby island before she sank completely. The battleship struggled forward at 6 knots, steering erratically because her rudder was partially submerged. Men abandoning ship while those remaining worked desperately to keep her alive a little longer. It was hopeless. At 1800 hours, the list reached 30 degrees. Men couldn't stand without bracing themselves. Water poured through ventilation shafts and hatches. The engineering spaces flooded, drowning men who'd stayed at their posts keeping the engines running. At 1900 hours, Musashi rolled onto her port side, her enormous hull rotating slowly. Men sliding down the sloping deck into the water. Captain Inoguchi was last seen standing on the bridge wing, sword in hand, choosing to go down with his ship according to tradition. At 1935 hours, Musashi's bow pointed straight up, her stern already submerged, and she slid beneath the surface stern first, while her bow hung in the air like an accusing finger pointing at heaven. 1,023 men died with her, trapped in flooded compartments or pulled under by the suction of her sinking. 1,100 survivors floated in oil-covered water, eventually picked up by destroyers. The death of Musashi proved several critical points about naval warfare's evolution. First, no battleship armor could withstand determined carrier air attack. 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits over 5 hours had killed the most heavily protected warship ever built. Second, American carrier tactics had matured enormously since early war fumbling. The coordinated strikes, multiple attack directions, and sustained pressure demonstrated thorough training and effective doctrine. Third, even killing Musashi had required massive effort. 259 aircraft sorties dropping bombs and torpedoes throughout an entire day. A less heavily armored ship would have sunk after the first or second wave. Musashi's sacrifice had bought time for the rest of Kurita's force by absorbing attacks that might otherwise have devastated cruisers and destroyers. But the sacrifice had another effect, unintended and ultimately more important than the tactical delay. At 15:30 hours after the third wave's devastating results became clear, Admiral Kurita ordered his entire force to reverse course, heading back west away from San Bernardino Strait. His staff assumed he was retreating, abandoning the operation after losing Musashi and taking damage to several other ships. American reconnaissance aircraft reported the reversal to Admiral Halsey aboard New Jersey. Halsey and his staff interpreted it as victory. Kurita's center force was defeated, no longer a threat, retreating from the Philippines. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong, because at 17:30 hours, Kurita reversed course again, heading back toward San Bernardino Strait, determined to complete his mission despite Musashi's loss. But by then, Halsey had made his decision based on incomplete information and faulty assumptions. The death of Musashi had convinced the Americans that Kurita was finished, and that belief would shape everything that followed. October 24, 1944, flag plot, USS New Jersey, 15:40 hours. Admiral William Frederick Halsey, Jr. stood over the plotting table in his flag quarters, studying the reports accumulating from multiple sources, feeling the pressure of decisions that would affect thousands of lives and possibly the entire campaign. At 62 years old, Bull Halsey was the most famous American naval commander in the Pacific, beloved by the public, respected by his men, and controversial among his fellow admirals. He'd built his reputation on aggressive action. His carriers had struck the Marshalls and Wake immediately after Pearl Harbor, when the Navy needed heroes. He'd commanded at Guadalcanal during its darkest moments. He'd earned his reputation for boldness, and boldness was now pulling him in a specific direction. The question was whether boldness or caution served the mission better, and Halsey's instincts always favored action over hesitation. The intelligence picture that afternoon was fragmentary but suggestive. Kurita's center force had been located in the Sibuyan Sea, attacked heavily throughout the day. reported as turning back at 15:30 hours. The super battleship Musashi had been sunk after absorbing enormous punishment. Other ships in Kurita's formation showed damage. American pilots reported the Japanese force reversing course, heading west, apparently retreating. To Halsey, this suggested victory. His carrier strikes had defeated the main Japanese threat, turned back their most powerful force before it reached San Bernardino Strait. But there were other reports, more intriguing. Search planes had located Japanese carriers north of Luzon, 4 carriers including Zuikaku, the last survivor from Pearl Harbor. Those carriers represented Halsey's primary mission: destroy the Japanese carrier force, eliminate Japan's ability to project air power at sea. The carriers pulled at Halsey like a magnet. Naval doctrine since Midway had emphasized carriers as the dominant weapon, the target worth pursuing above all others. Halsey had studied carrier warfare, commanded carriers, believed absolutely in their primacy. Battleships were powerful, but ultimately defensive assets, useful for shore bombardment and escort, but not decisive. Carriers could strike hundreds of miles away, could cripple entire fleets without being seen, represented the future of naval warfare. If Japanese carriers were north of Luzon, steaming south toward Philippine waters, they needed to be destroyed before they could launch strikes against American forces. The fact that those carriers were operating suggested they carried aircraft and posed a real threat. Halsey couldn't know that Ozawa's carriers were nearly empty, that the few aircraft they'd launched that morning were mostly sacrificed just to make the carriers visible. At 16:40 hours, Halsey made his decision. He would take his entire fleet, all 8 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 6 fast battleships, 17 cruisers, 64 destroyers, and head north to destroy Ozawa's carriers. He would not split his force, would not leave ships to guard San Bernardino Strait, would not divide his attention. This decision reflected both doctrine and personality. The Navy's administrative system divided forces into numbered fleets. Halsey commanded 3rd Fleet, Kinkaid commanded 7th Fleet, but they both reported to MacArthur for the Leyte operation. This meant no unified naval commander controlled both fleets. Halsey believed his responsibility was destroying enemy fleets, particularly carriers. Kinkaid's responsibility was supporting the invasion, protecting the transports. Guarding San Bernardino Strait seemed like Kinkaid's job, not Halsey's. If Japanese battleships somehow came through the strait, and Halsey doubted they would after the beating they'd taken, Kinkaid's old battleships could handle them. The fatal assumption was communicated through a message that Halsey had sent hours earlier, but that now took on enormous importance. At 14:12 hours, Halsey had ordered his staff to prepare a battle plan for confronting Japanese surface forces if they approached San Bernardino Strait. The plan, designated Battle Plan 5 Able, called for forming Task Force 34, 4 Iowa-class fast battleships, 5 cruisers, and 14 destroyers under Vice Admiral Willis Lee. The message went out to all 3rd Fleet units. If the enemy sorties, Task Force 34 will be formed. This was a preparatory order, not an execution order. It told Lee to be ready to form his battle line, not that he should actually form it. But the message was also received by 7th Fleet units because they were on the same communication circuits. Admiral Kinkaid read it and interpreted it as confirmation that Halsey was guarding San Bernardino Strait with his fast battleships. The assumption spread through both fleets. Kinkaid's staff believed Task Force 34 existed and was positioned to intercept any Japanese ships coming through San Bernardino Strait. Halsey's staff knew the task force hadn't actually formed yet, that it was a contingency plan only. Neither staff confirmed their assumptions with the other because both admirals thought the situation was clear. This communication failure, assuming the other commander understood your intentions without explicit confirmation, would prove nearly catastrophic. As Halsey's fleet turned north at 2000 hours on October 24th, heading away from Leyte Gulf to chase Ozawa's carriers, San Bernardino Strait was completely unguarded. Kinkaid thought Halsey was covering it. Halsey thought Kinkaid could handle anything that came through. Both were wrong. The night of October 24th passed, while Halsey steamed north at 25 knots, his massive fleet churning through darkness toward the enemy carriers. In flag plot aboard New Jersey, intelligence officers tracked Ozawa's position based on radio direction finding and search plane reports. The Japanese carriers were approximately 300 miles north of 3rd Fleet's position, steaming south, apparently seeking battle. Perfect. Halsey would reach attack range by dawn, launch strikes at first light, sink all 4 carriers before they could escape. His staff calculated odds and probabilities. Ozawa had perhaps 120 aircraft total across 4 carriers. Third Fleet had over 1,000 aircraft across 16 carriers. The battle would be one-sided, a slaughter similar to the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and it would eliminate Japan's carrier capability entirely. That outcome justified the northern movement, justified leaving San Bernardino Strait uncovered. Or so Halsey believed, as midnight approached and his fleet continued north. But 300 miles to the southwest, Kurita's center force was approaching San Bernardino Strait from the west. The force had reversed course again, at 1730 hours. Kurita determined to complete his mission despite Musashi's loss and damage to other ships. His remaining 4 battleships, Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, Haruna, steamed through the strait's narrow waters after dark. Navigation lights actually turned on to avoid grounding in the tricky currents and shoals. American night reconnaissance aircraft spotted them, reported their passage, but those reports took hours to reach Halsey because they went through 7th Fleet channels first, then had to be relayed to 3rd Fleet. By the time the information reached New Jersey, it was after midnight. Halsey's fleet was 200 miles north of San Bernardino, and Halsey was focused entirely on the carrier battle he expected at dawn. The strategic situation at midnight on October 24th was approaching crisis without most of the participants recognizing it. Kurita's battleships were east of San Bernardino Strait, heading south along Samar's coast, steaming directly toward the northern escort carrier groups of 7th Fleet. Those escort carriers, 16 small, slow, thin-skinned ships carrying 28 aircraft each, represented the only significant American naval forces in Kurita's path. They weren't designed for surface combat. Their pilots flew obsolete Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers, armed and trained for supporting ground troops, not attacking battleships. Between Kurita's guns and Kinkaid's transports in Leyte Gulf sat exactly 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers of Taffy 3, a force so outmatched that engagement seemed suicidal, yet engagement was hours away, approaching with mathematical certainty as both forces steamed through the darkness toward a dawn encounter neither expected. Halsey continued north, oblivious to the crisis developing behind him, focused on the carriers ahead. In his mind, he'd made the correct decision: destroy the carriers, eliminate the primary threat, trust Kamikaze to handle anything else. The Navy's institutional culture supported this thinking. Officers were trained to pursue enemy carriers aggressively, to view carrier destruction as the highest priority. Halsey was following doctrine, following his instincts, following orders that emphasized destroying the Japanese fleet. That all those imperatives pointed north toward Ozawa's decoy carriers, rather than south toward Kurita's battleships, approaching the vulnerable transports, was exactly what Ozawa's plan intended. The bait had been taken, the trap was closing, and the largest naval battle in history was about to explode across multiple separate engagements spanning hundreds of square miles of Philippine waters, each engagement desperate, each outcome uncertain, the entire campaign's success suddenly hanging by threads. October 24th, 1944. Flag Bridge Carrier Zukaku, Philippine Sea. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on his flagship's bridge watching the afternoon sun descend toward the horizon, knowing that each passing hour brought him closer to the only kind of victory he could achieve: dying successfully. Around him, Zuikaku's deck was nearly empty of aircraft, just 29 planes secured to the flight deck out of the 75 she'd been designed to carry. The other 3 carriers of his force, Zuikaku, Chitos, Chiyoda, together carried 79 more aircraft, and most of those pilots had trained for fewer than 150 hours, barely enough to take off and land safely, nowhere near enough for effective combat. Ozawa had sent 42 of his precious aircraft south that morning, in a deliberate sacrifice, launching them toward American positions with orders to attack if possible, but primarily to be seen. 29 had failed to return. The losses hurt, but they'd accomplished the mission's first objective, making the Americans aware that Japanese carriers were operating north of Luzon. The second objective required more active measures. Throughout the afternoon, Ozawa's radio operators had been transmitting constantly, breaking the radio silence that usually protected naval forces from detection. Weather reports went out in codes the Americans had broken months ago. Position updates that weren't quite accurate but close enough to be useful. Tactical queries to shore stations that provided no valuable information but generated electronic signatures. Every transmission was designed to help American direction-finding equipment locate Ozawa's force, to make the carriers as visible electronically as possible. This violated every principle of naval communications security, deliberately announcing his presence to the enemy, but that was precisely the point. Ozawa needed Halsey to find him, needed to be such a tempting target that the American admiral would abandon everything else to chase carriers. The reports filtering back from reconnaissance aircraft suggested the deception was working. American carrier aircraft had struck Kurita's center force throughout the day, inflicting serious damage, sinking Musashi after 5 hours of attacks. That was expected. Kurita's mission required him to absorb American airstrikes while approaching San Bernardino Strait, and the loss of even Musashi was acceptable if it bought time and drew American attention. More importantly, intelligence indicated that American carriers were withdrawing from supporting Kurita's avenue of approach, repositioning for operations farther north. Ozawa allowed himself cautious optimism. If Halsey was moving north, if American carriers were losing contact with Kurita, then the fundamental premise of Sho-1 might actually work. Sacrifice the carriers to draw away American air power, while Kurita's battleships approached the vulnerable transports in Leyte Gulf. Ozawa understood his role with perfect clarity, because he'd been given orders that left no room for interpretation. Combined Fleet Operation Order No. 84, issued October 18th, stated explicitly, the mission of main body is to decoy the enemy carrier force. Not attack, not damage, not defend. Decoy, lead them away. His success would be measured not by enemy ships sunk, but by how far north he could lure Halsey, how long he could keep American carriers engaged and unable to strike Kurita. If Ozawa's entire force was annihilated in the process, that was acceptable, even expected. The 4 carriers, 2 hybrid battleship carriers, 3 cruisers, and 8 destroyers under his command represented Japan's last carrier capability. But they were carriers without adequate aircraft or pilots, essentially hollow shells, whose only remaining value was as bait. The human dimension of this sacrifice mission was something Ozawa contemplated privately, but never discussed with his staff. Zukaku alone carried over 1,600 officers and men, most of them in their 20s, many conscripted from farms and factories to fill out the crew after experienced sailors had been transferred to other ships or killed in previous battles. These young men swabbed decks, loaded supplies, stood watches, maintaining the ship's routine, while knowing their mission was fundamentally suicidal. Some had written final letters home before departing the inland sea. Others simply accepted their fate with the resignation that Japanese military culture encouraged. Shikata ga nai, it cannot be helped, the phrase that encompassed acceptance of circumstances beyond one's control. Ozawa bore responsibility for leading them to almost certain death, a burden that showed in his increasingly haggard appearance during the approach south. October 25th dawned clear with light winds, perfect flying weather. At 0630 hours, Ozawa launched his first strike, 75 aircraft, nearly everything flyable, heading south toward where reconnaissance placed the American fast carrier force. This would be his final offensive gesture, a last opportunity for his pilots to strike at the enemy before the inevitable American counterattack arrived. Most of the pilots were teenagers, promoted to flight status after abbreviated training because Japan desperately needed carrier pilots. They flew south in ragged formations, lacking the tight discipline that characterized American and earlier Japanese naval aviation. Some would find American ships and attack courageously, despite their limited skills. Others would get lost, run out of fuel, ditch in the ocean, or crash into islands. Only 29 would return to Ozawa's carriers, and several of those were too damaged to fly again. The sacrifice of these pilots served its purpose by making Ozawa's force impossible to ignore. American radar detected the incoming raid 100 miles out. Hellcat fighters vectored to intercept, shooting down most of the attackers before they reached the American fleet. But the attack confirmed what Halsey needed to know. These carriers were operating offensively, launching strikes posing an active threat. They weren't decoys or empty shells. They were combat units requiring immediate destruction. At 0800 hours, Halsey sent the order his staff had been preparing since midnight. Strike, repeat, strike. Third Fleet's massive air groups began launching, wave after wave of Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers taking off from 16 carrier decks, heading north toward Ozawa's position. The bait had been taken completely. Halsey was committed to the carrier battle. Ozawa received reports of the incoming American strike at 0930 hours. Over 180 aircraft in the first wave, with more behind them. His carriers had perhaps 30 fighters available for defense after the morning's offensive consumed most of his strength. The mathematics were hopeless, 6 fighters per carrier against 45 American aircraft per carrier. But mathematics didn't matter anymore. He'd accomplished his mission. Halsey was here, 300 miles north of San Bernardino Strait, fully engaged with Ozawa's carriers, incapable of interfering with Kurita's approach to Leyte Gulf. Whether Ozawa survived the next few hours was irrelevant to the operation's success. He'd brought his ships to the right place at the right time, had made himself visible and threatening enough to draw the Americans away from what really mattered. Now came the price. The first American strike arrived at 10:10 hours. Hellcats swept ahead, shooting down the handful of defending Zeros. Then the bombers came through unopened. Bombs and torpedoes rained down on Ozawa's carriers, while anti-aircraft fire created black smudges across the sky. Light carrier Chitose took 3 bombs in quick succession, the explosions rupturing her thin deck and igniting aviation fuel below. She began listing immediately, fires spreading through her hangar deck. Light carrier Chiyoda took 2 torpedoes that flooded her engine rooms, leaving her dead in the water, defenseless. Zuikaku maneuvered violently, her captain throwing the big carrier through tight turns that defeated most torpedo attacks, but several bombs hit topside, starting fires and killing gun crews. The attacks lasted 20 minutes of sustained violence. Then the American aircraft withdrew to rearm, while more waves prepared to launch from the American carriers. The second and third strikes came at noon and 1300 hours, systematically destroying what the first wave had damaged. Chiyoda capsized and sank at 12:30 hours, her crew abandoning ship in good order, but over 900 men drowning when the carrier rolled and trapped them below decks. Chiyoda, dead in the water and burning, became target practice for American dive bombers, absorbing hit after hit until she finally sank at 14:30 hours. Zuiho, the smallest carrier, took multiple torpedoes and bombs throughout the afternoon, stubbornly refusing to sink until American cruisers closed range and finished her with gunfire at 1600 hours. By mid-afternoon, 3 of Ozawa's 4 carriers were gone, and Zuikaku was burning from multiple bomb hits, listing to port, her flight deck buckled and useless. Aboard Zuikaku, the situation deteriorated through the afternoon. Fires spread despite damage control efforts. Flooding progressed through lower compartments. The list increased to 15 degrees, making movement difficult. At 1500 hours, Captain Kaname Kanishi ordered abandoned ship. Sailors gathered on the tilting deck, some jumping into the water, others waiting for destroyers to approach close enough to transfer. Admiral Ozawa refused to leave until the last moment, standing on the bridge wing, watching his flagship die. Zuikaku had been commissioned in September 1941, had participated in Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, the Coral Sea, the Eastern Solomons. She'd survived 3 years of war, longer than any of her sister carriers. Now, in the late afternoon sun of October 25, 1944, she rolled onto her side and sank, her hull disappearing beneath the waves, while Ozawa watched from a destroyer that had rescued him minutes earlier. The loss of all 4 carriers represented the complete destruction of Japan's carrier capability. But Ozawa felt no despair as he transferred his flag to a cruiser that evening. His mission had succeeded. Halsey had taken the bait, had committed his entire force to destroying Ozawa's carriers, had spent the entire day 300 miles from San Bernardino Strait. Radio messages intercept indicated that Kurita's center force had passed through San Bernardino during the night, was now approaching Leyte Gulf from the north, while 7th Fleet battleships were engaged with Nishimura's southern force at Surigao Strait. The American invasion fleet was caught between 2 Japanese forces, exactly as Sho-1 envisioned. Whether Kurita could exploit the opportunity remained uncertain, but Ozawa had done everything asked of him. He'd sacrificed his carriers, his aircraft, his men, and approximately 1,500 sailors had died in the afternoon slaughter. But they died accomplishing their mission, and in the calculus of Japanese naval thinking, that made the sacrifice meaningful rather than wasteful. The battle off Cape Engano, the Spanish word meaning deception, a grimly appropriate name, ended as the sun set on October 25th. American ships withdrew south, preparing to pursue Ozawa's surviving cruisers and destroyers the next day. Halsey's carriers had achieved a one-sided victory, sinking 4 carriers and a destroyer while losing only 43 aircraft. But the victory was hollow because it had been purchased at the price of leaving Leyte Gulf exposed. While Halsey's pilots celebrated their success, delivering the final blow to Japan's carrier force, 300 miles south, a vastly more important battle was reaching its crisis. Kurita's battleships had encountered the escort carriers of Taffy 3, and for 2 hours that morning, the outcome of the entire Leyte campaign had hung by threads as destroyers charged battleships and escort carriers fled for their lives. Ozawa knew nothing about that battle. Radio communications were fragmentary, his surviving ships were scattered, he had no clear picture of what was happening at Leyte, but he knew he'd done his part. The rest was up to Kurita and fate. October 25, 1944. Flag plot, USS New Jersey, 0900 hours. The message from Admiral Kinkaid arrived in 3rd Fleet's radio room at 0822 hours, its priority marking demanding immediate attention. Enemy battleships and cruisers reported firing on TO 77.4.3 from 15 miles astern. Commander Harold Stassen, Halsey's flag secretary, carried the message to the Admiral's quarters where Halsey was reviewing aircraft strike reports from the morning's attacks on Ozawa's carriers. Halsey read it once, his face flushing red. Read it again, trying to understand how this could be happening. Task Unit 77.4.3 was Taffy 3-6, escort carriers and 7 destroyers off Samar. Enemy battleships should not be anywhere near Taffy 3, because Kurita's center force was supposed to be crippled and retreating, and even if it wasn't, Task Force 34 was supposed to be guarding San Bernardino Strait. Except Task Force 34 had never actually formed, had never taken station at the strait, because Halsey had taken his entire fleet north to chase Ozawa's carriers. More messages arrived in rapid succession, each more desperate than the last. 0830 hours. Urgently need fast battleships Leyte Gulf at once. 0900 hours. Situation critical. Escort carriers under heavy attack by cruisers and battleships. 0922 hours. In plain language that violated every security protocol but conveyed absolute urgency. My situation is critical. Fast battleships and support by airstrikes may be able to keep enemy from destroying CVs and entering Lake. Halsey stood in flag plots surrounded by his staff, watching the messages pile up, realizing that the crisis unfolding 300 miles south was his fault. He'd left San Bernardino Strait unguarded. He'd assumed Kinkaid could handle anything that came through. He'd taken the bait Ozawa had dangled, and now American escort carriers, thin-skinned, slow, nearly defenseless, were fighting for their lives against Japanese battleships. The decision matrix facing Halsey at that moment was agonizing. 300 miles south, American ships were dying. 300 miles north, Ozawa's surviving carriers were retreating, damaged but not yet sunk. If Halsey turned the entire fleet south, he could reach Samar by late afternoon, maybe in time to save some of Taffy 3's ships, definitely in time to intercept Kurita before he reached the main invasion fleet. But turning south meant abandoning the carrier battle, letting Ozawa escape with 2 or 3 carriers still afloat, failing to complete the destruction of Japan's carrier force. If Halsey divided his fleet, sending the battleships south while keeping the carriers north, he weakened both forces, potentially losing both objectives. Naval doctrine emphasized concentration of force, avoiding the mistake of dividing your strength where the enemy could defeat both halves separately. But doctrine hadn't anticipated this situation. 2 critical battles occurring simultaneously hundreds of miles apart. For nearly an hour, Halsey tried to balance impossible priorities. He ordered his carriers to continue striking Ozawa's force. Finish the job, sink all the carriers. He detached Task Force 34 under Admiral Lee, finally forming the battle line that should have formed the previous day, and ordered it south at maximum speed toward Leyte Gulf. But the battleships were 300 miles away from Samar, steaming at 25 knots. Requiring at least 6 hours to reach the battle area. The mathematics were brutal. Taffy 3 was fighting now, 0900 hours. Task Force 34 wouldn't arrive until 1500 hours at the earliest. In those 6 hours, Kurita's battleships could destroy every escort carrier, sink every destroyer, possibly even reach Leyte Gulf, and start shelling the transports. Everything depended on Taffy 3 surviving against impossible odds, and there was nothing Halsey could do to help them for 6 hours. Then came the message that broke Halsey's composure completely. At 1000 hours, a dispatch from Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor arrived, marked urgent priority, where is Task Force 34RR? The world wonders. Halsey read it and threw his cap to the deck in rage. The message seemed like sarcasm, Nimitz publicly questioning his judgment, asking why the battleships weren't where they should be, adding the unnecessary jab, the world wonders, as commentary on Halsey's failure. In fact, the phrase was padding, random words added by communication officers to confuse enemy code breakers, meaningless filler that should have been removed before delivering the message, but accidentally got left in. Nimitz hadn't written the world wonders. Some radio man had added it automatically, but Halsey didn't know that, and to him the message read like his superior officer was publicly humiliating him, while American sailors fought and died because of his decision. The psychological pressure at that moment exceeded anything Halsey had experienced in 3 years of war. He was simultaneously fighting 2 major battles, had made a decision that endangered the entire Leyte campaign, was being second-guessed by Nimitz, and faced the prospect of escort carriers being slaughtered while his battleship steamed impotently 300 miles away. Some of his staff officers later recalled that Halsey looked like he might have a stroke, his face purple with rage and frustration, pacing flag plot like a caged animal. Finally, at 10:15 hours, he made his decision. Recall Task Force 34, which had barely started south. Recall the carriers from pursuing Ozawa. Turn the entire 3rd Fleet south, all 16 carriers, all 6 battleships, all cruisers and destroyers. Abandon the carrier battle, head for Leyte at maximum speed. The turn south happened at 10:25 hours. Every ship in 3rd Fleet changing course simultaneously, heading away from Ozawa's battered but still floating carriers, racing towards Samar, where the battle would be decided not by Halsey, but by the men of Taffy 3, who were already fighting for their survival. The decision meant Ozawa would escape with 2 carriers, Isan Hyuga, the hybrid battleship carriers that had survived the morning attacks. It meant abandoning a certain victory in favor of possibly preventing a catastrophic defeat. But it was the right decision, the only decision, because what was happening off Samar mattered infinitely more than sinking 2 more carriers. The invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf represented the entire strategic purpose of this campaign. Those transports carried ammunition, fuel, food supplies for 174,000 troops. Lose those transports and the 6th Army would be stranded, potentially destroyed, or forced to evacuate. Everything depended on stopping Kurita before he reached Leyte Gulf. But even as 3rd Fleet turned south, Halsey and his staff knew they would arrive too late for the critical battle. Task Force 34, the 6 fast battleships that should have been guarding San Bernardino Strait, that Kinkaid had assumed were guarding the strait, was now 320 miles from Samar, steaming south at 25 knots. Basic mathematics gave arrival time approximately 1,300 hours, possibly 1,400 hours after accounting for course changes and tactical maneuvering. The desperate messages from Taffy 3 indicated the battle was happening now, this moment, 0900 through 1000 hours. In the 4 hours before Halsey's battleships could possibly intervene, everything would be decided by the 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers of Taffy 3, fighting alone against 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The morning continued with agonizing slowness while 3rd Fleet steamed south and fragmentary reports filtered in from Samar. 10:00 hours, under attack by 4 battleships, 8 cruisers. 10:30 hours, Gambier Bay hit and dead in water. 1100 hours, Johnston sinking. Each message represented American ships dying, sailors drowning, the protective screen around Leyte Gulf being destroyed piece by piece. Halsey could do nothing except steam south and pray that somehow, impossibly, Taffy 3 would hold long enough for help to arrive. His staff maintained professional composure, but everyone in Flag Plot understood the magnitude of what might be happening. The worst American naval defeat since Pearl Harbor, occurring because their admiral had been deceived by a blatant decoy. The command decisions that morning would be debated for decades afterward. Should Halsey have split his force the previous day, leaving Task Force 34 at San Bernardino while taking carriers north? Should he have turned south immediately when Kinkaid's first urgent message arrived at 0822? Should he have ignored Nimitz's message about Task Force 34 and kept his battleships racing south instead of recalling them? Each decision point offered alternatives. Each alternative carried risks, and hindsight would provide clarity that didn't exist in the moment. But one fact was indisputable. Halsey had taken the bait Ozawa offered, had spent October 25th destroying empty carriers while Japanese battleships approached the invasion fleet he was supposed to protect. Whether that decision would prove catastrophic or merely embarrassing depended entirely on what happened in the waters off Samar, where destroyers were charging battleships in the most desperate naval action of the entire war. As noon approached, Third Fleet continued south, still hours from the battle area. Halsey stood in flag plot monitoring reports, awaiting news of disaster or miracle. He'd made his decisions, right or wrong, and now outcomes were beyond his control. Somewhere ahead, Taffy 3 was fighting alone. Somewhere ahead, Kurita's battleships were firing on defenseless escort carriers. And somewhere ahead, the entire Leyte campaign hung in the balance, determined not by admirals and battle plans but by individual courage under fire, by destroyers willing to die to buy minutes, by pilots flying obsolete aircraft against impossible odds. The world wondered where Task Force 34 was. The answer was simple and terrible. 300 miles away when it was needed most, racing to a battle that might already be lost. October 25, 1944. Off Samar Island, 0645 hours. Ensign Bill Brooks stood on the bridge of escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, binoculars raised, scanning the horizon in the gray pre-dawn light, as he'd done 1,000 times before during routine morning watches. The 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Callinan Bay, Kitkun Bay, Gambier Bay, steamed in a circular formation with 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, providing anti-submarine screen. This was supposed to be a quiet sector. The real Navy, Halsey's fast carriers and battleships, was somewhere north, chasing Japanese flat tops. Taffy 3's job was boring but essential. Launch aircraft to support troops on Leyte, provide anti-submarine patrols, maybe shoot down the occasional Japanese reconnaissance plane. Brooks yawned, thinking about breakfast, when something on the horizon caught his eye. Masts. Large masts. Too many of them. He focused his binoculars and felt ice form in his stomach. Pagoda masts. The distinctive multi-tiered superstructures of Japanese battleships. "Captain to the bridge," he shouted into the intercom, his voice cracking with stress. "Sir, I see what look like Japanese battleships bearing 340. The impossible was happening. At 0658 hours, Taffy 3's radar confirmed what lookouts were reporting. Multiple large surface contacts 20 miles away, closing at high speed. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from Fanshawe Bay, stared at the radar returns trying to understand how Japanese battleships could be here, off Samar, when they should be either sunk or retreating west of the Philippines. Task Force 34 was supposed to be guarding San Bernardino Strait. Where was Halsey? What had happened? No time to figure it out because the Japanese were closing at better than 25 knots, and Taffy 3's escort carriers could only make 17 knots flat out. Mathematics gave the answer. His ships would be under fire within 30 minutes, and once those battleship guns found the range, his thin-skinned flat tops would die like sheep in a slaughterhouse. 0701 hours. Aboard destroyer USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans had been awake for hours, drinking coffee on his bridge, when the report came through: Japanese battleships closing from the north. Evans was a Creek Indian from Oklahoma, 44 years old, a career officer who'd commanded Johnston since her commissioning. He looked at the tactical situation: 6 escort carriers trying to run south, Japanese battleships closing from the north at superior speed, and made his decision instantly. Without waiting for orders, without consulting Admiral Sprague, he turned to his officer of the deck. All ahead flank. General quarters, prepare to attack major caliber ships. Johnston surged forward at 35 knots, heading directly toward the Japanese formation. A 360-foot destroyer charging battleships that outweighed her 20-1. At 0710 hours, the Japanese opened fire. 18-inch shells from battleship Yamato, each projectile weighing more than a small car, began falling around the escort carriers, creating waterspouts 200 feet high. The sound was like the earth splitting open, massive explosions that shook ships' hulls even when the shells missed. White Plains took a near miss that sent shrapnel across her flight deck, killing 5 sailors. Gambier Bay's captain saw shells straddling his ship, one splashing short, the next long, and knew the Japanese gunners were bracketing, that the next salvo would hit. Admiral Sprague ordered his carriers to make smoke, to run for a rain squall visible on the horizon, to launch every available aircraft regardless of whether they carried weapons. Anything to buy time, to create confusion, to survive another 5 minutes. Johnston reached torpedo range at 0720 hours. Commander Evans ordered fire all torpedoes, and 10 Mark 15 torpedoes erupted from Johnston's tubes, their wakes streaming toward the Japanese heavy cruiser column. Then Evans turned hard right, presenting Johnston's stern to the enemy, making smoke to cover the retreat. Behind him, the other 2 destroyers of the screen, USS Hole and USS Heermann, also charged forward, firing torpedoes, buying time for the carriers. The destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, followed despite being smaller, slower, more lightly armed. 7 ships, total displacement 21,000 tons, attacking a Japanese force displacing over 300,000 tons. It wasn't tactics, it was sacrifice. The Japanese formation dissolved into chaos as torpedoes forced violent evasive maneuvers. Heavy cruisers turned away, battleships twisted to comb wakes, the neat columns becoming scattered groups. Evans' torpedoes hit heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow, forcing her out of the battle. But the respite lasted only minutes, because the Japanese had too many ships, too many guns, too much firepower to be stopped by destroyers alone. At 0730 hours, 3 heavy cruisers focused fire on Johnston. An 8-inch shell penetrated her bridge, killing and wounding half the bridge crew. Another shell destroyed Johnston's aft engine room, killing everyone inside instantly. A third shell demolished her aft main battery turret. Within 5 minutes, Johnston was crippled. Speed down to 17 knots, steering from an emergency station aft, fires raging amidships. Evans refused to stop fighting. Johnston still had one functioning forward turret, still had working radar, still could direct fire. For the next hour and 40 minutes, Johnston fought on alone, firing at Japanese cruisers whenever they approached the carriers, absorbing punishment that should have sunk her. Shells tore through her thin hull armor. Fires spread. The list increased to 10 degrees. Men fought those fires with buckets because pumps had lost pressure. Officers passed orders by shouting because all internal communications were destroyed. At 0900 hours, Johnston had taken so many hits that she was literally disintegrating, her deck plates buckling, her superstructure collapsing. Evans finally ordered abandon ship, and men jumped into the oil-covered water while Johnston settled deeper, bow first. Commander Evans was last seen on the stern, wounded from multiple shrapnel hits, refusing to leave his ship. At 0910 hours, Johnston rolled onto her beam ends and sank. Of her 327 crew members, 186 were killed or died in the water afterward. Evans' body was never recovered. He would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for an attack that naval historians would later describe as one of the most courageous actions in U.S. Submarines. Navy history: a destroyer deliberately charging battleships to buy time for carriers that couldn't defend themselves. USS Hole charged next, her captain seeing Johnston engaging and deciding to join the attack. Hold closed to 8,000 yards from the Japanese battleship column, fired all her torpedoes, then turned to retreat while making smoke. Japanese heavy cruisers caught her in a crossfire. Shells destroyed Hole's bridge, killed her captain, wrecked her engine rooms. She drifted dead in the water while cruisers systematically pounded her to scrap metal. At 0855 hours, with fires raging throughout the ship and the forward magazine in danger of exploding, the surviving officers ordered abandon ship. Hold sank at 0900 hours, taking 253 men with her, including her captain, who'd refused to leave his post. Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort smaller and less armed than the fleet destroyers, made perhaps the most improbable charge of the entire battle. Commander Robert Copeland ordered his ship to attack heavy cruisers, closing to within 5,000 yards point-blank range for ship combat and firing over 600 5-inch shells in 35 minutes, an impossible rate of fire that required his gun crews to work like madmen, ignoring burned hands and exhaustion. Roberts' torpedoes hit heavy cruiser Chokai, crippling her, but cruisers turned their 14-inch guns on the tiny destroyer escort and shredded her. At 0930 hours, Roberts was sinking, her hull torn open by dozens of hits. 90 men dead, and Commander Copeland was ordering abandoned ship while standing on the tilting deck, making sure every living sailor got off before the ship went under. While destroyers died buying time, the escort carriers ran south at maximum speed. their aircraft launching without proper arming, pilots flying with machine guns and small bombs meant for ground support, attacking battleships with weapons that couldn't possibly sink them but could harass, distract, force evasive maneuvers. Pilots made repeated runs, dropping their ordnance, returning to carriers just long enough to rearm, launching again. Some flew with no weapons at all, just making dummy runs to force Japanese ships to maneuver. The sky filled with aircraft, smoke, shell bursts, the noise constant and overwhelming. At 0820 hours, Japanese shells found escort carrier Gambier Bay. The first hit destroyed her aft engine room. The second ruptured fuel tanks. The third penetrated the flight deck and exploded inside the hangar. Gambier Bay slowed, fell behind the formation, became an isolated target. Heavy cruisers closed to 10,000 yards and began systematically destroying her. For 40 minutes, Gambier Bay absorbed punishment, her crew fighting fires, trying desperately to restore power, refusing to abandon ship. At 0900 hours, with the ship clearly doomed, the captain ordered abandon. Gambier Bay rolled onto her side at 0907 hours and sank, taking 800 men with her. Then, impossibly, the Japanese turned away at 0925 hours, with victory within reach, with the surviving escort carriers defenseless and ready to be destroyed. Admiral Kurita ordered his force to break off the attack and retire north. The decision baffled everyone who witnessed it. American sailors watched in disbelief as Japanese battleships and cruisers turned away from targets they'd been chasing for 2 hours. Kurita's reasons were complex, confused by radio deception, convinced he was fighting Halsey's fleet carriers instead of escort carriers, worried about fuel, shaken by the ferocious destroyer attacks, believing he'd accomplished enough damage. Whatever his reasoning, the order to withdraw saved Taffy 3's 5 surviving carriers and prevented Japanese battleships from reaching Leyte Gulf, where hundreds of defenseless transports waited. The battle off Samar lasted 2.5 hours, from 0658 when the Japanese were sighted until 0925 when they withdrew. In that time, Taffy 3 lost 1 escort carrier sunk, 2 destroyers sunk, 1 destroyer escort sunk. Over 1,000 American sailors died. But they'd achieved the impossible, stopping 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers through courage and sacrifice. Naval historians would later call it the most gallant naval action in American history. The men who fought it simply called it survival, bought at a price measured in ships and lives, purchased by commanders like Evans, who charged battleships knowing they would die, by pilots who flew unarmed aircraft against impossible odds, by sailors who fought fires and pumped water and fired guns until their ships sank beneath them. They'd saved the Leyte invasion not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through willingness to die rather than surrender, and their sacrifice would ensure MacArthur's return became permanent rather than temporary. October 24th to 25th, 1944, Surigao Strait night. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf stood in the Combat Information Center aboard battleship USS Louisville, studying the tactical plot with satisfaction. For 30 hours, he'd been positioning his forces for this moment, preparing the most perfect naval ambush in modern history. 6 battleships stretched in line across the northern mouth of Surigao Strait, their 14-inch and 16-inch guns loaded and ready. 8 cruisers flanked the battle line, adding their 6-inch and 8-inch batteries. 28 destroyers positioned themselves in 2 groups along the strait's eastern and western shores, ready to launch torpedo attacks as Japanese ships approached. 39 PT boats patrolled the southern approaches, serving as early warning and first attack wave. The ambush was textbook perfect, the kind of setup that admirals dream about but rarely achieve, crossing the enemy's T, bringing every gun to bear while the approaching force could only fire forward batteries. Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force was steaming directly into this trap. His 2 battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, were veterans of the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, modernized but fundamentally obsolete. 1 heavy cruiser, Mogami, and 4 destroyers completed his force. Nishimura knew Surigao Strait was the obvious approach to Leyte Gulf from the south, knew the Americans would defend it, but his orders required him to transit the strait and emerge into Leyte Gulf at dawn on October 25th, coordinating with Kurita's center force, attacking from the north. The timing was critical. If both Japanese forces reached Leyte simultaneously, they'd divide American defenses, creating chaos. If only one force arrived, it would face concentrated opposition, so Nishimura pressed forward despite increasing evidence that disaster awaited. The battle began at 22:36 hours on October 24th, when PT boats attacked Nishimura's force in the southern approaches. The little plywood boats roared out of the darkness, launching torpedoes from 1,000 yards, then racing away while Japanese destroyers fired wildly. Most torpedoes missed. PT boat torpedoes were notoriously unreliable, and launching from a small boat bouncing in swells rarely produced accurate aim. But the PT attacks achieved their purpose, alerting Oldendorf that the Japanese were coming, forcing Nishimura to maneuver and slow down, fraying nerves among Japanese sailors who knew worse was waiting ahead. At 0200 hours on October 25th, the first destroyer torpedo attack struck. American destroyers positioned along the strait's western shore launched coordinated salvos. 47 torpedoes in the water simultaneously, converging on Nishimura's column from the port side. The Japanese formation couldn't dodge them all. At 0309 hours, torpedoes struck battleship Fuso amidships. Multiple explosions broke Fuso's back, the battleship jackknifing, bow and stern rising while the center section sank. Within minutes, Fuso had broken into two pieces, both sections burning fiercely, lighting up the night. 500 men died instantly. The survivors swam through oil-covered water, many drowning before rescue vessels arrived. Nishimura pressed forward with his remaining ships, seemingly undeterred by Fuso's destruction. At 0330 hours, a second destroyer torpedo wave attacked from the eastern shore. 3 of Nishimura's 4 destroyers were hit and sunk within 10 minutes. Now only battleship Yamashiro, cruiser Mogami, and 1 destroyer remained, still advancing north into the strait, heading directly toward Oldendorf's battle line. It was naval suicide, continuing forward after losing half your force, but Nishimura had his orders and his duty. Japanese naval culture emphasized attacking regardless of odds, dying rather than retreating. Nishimura would complete his mission or die trying. At 0351 hours, battleship West Virginia's fire control radar locked onto Yamashiro at 22,800 yards, over 12 miles away. This was the technological advantage that made modern naval warfare so lethal. Radar-directed gunfire that could achieve hits in total darkness at ranges where optical sights saw nothing. West Virginia's main battery officer received firing solution from the computer, confirmed range and bearing, ordered commence firing. 8 14-inch guns erupted simultaneously, hurling 1-ton shells toward a target invisible to human eyes. 20 seconds later, those shells struck Yamashiro's superstructure, starting fires that illuminated the doomed battleship for other American ships. The battle line opened fire in sequence. California, Tennessee, Maryland, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, every battleship that had survived or missed, Pearl Harbor, now got revenge against a Japanese battleship silhouetted by its own fires. Cruisers added their batteries, creating a storm of steel that no ship could survive. Yamashiro staggered under the bombardment, hit repeatedly by 14-inch and 16-inch shells that penetrated her deck armor and exploded inside. Fires spread, magazines detonated, the superstructure collapsed. At 0400 hours, Admiral Nishimura transmitted his final message: "You are to proceed and attack all ships." Then Yamashiro rolled onto her side and sank, taking Nishimura and over 1,400 men to the bottom of Surigao Strait. The slaughter continued. Cruiser Mogami, burning from multiple hits, tried to reverse course and escape south. American cruisers pursued, firing continuously, hitting Mogami so many times that she became a floating inferno. The sole surviving destroyer launched a desperate torpedo attack that missed, then fled south at maximum speed. By 0430 hours, the battle was over. Oldendorf ordered ceasefire. His ships had fired hundreds of tons of ammunition, over 4,000 rounds of 6-inch and larger shells, dozens of torpedoes, destroying Nishimura's entire force, except 1 destroyer, that somehow escaped. American casualties, 39 men wounded, no ships seriously damaged. Japanese casualties, 2 battleships sunk, 1 cruiser destroyed, 3 destroyers sunk, over 4,000 men killed. The Battle of Surigao Strait was the last time opposing battleship lines engaged in combat. Every naval battle afterward would be decided by aircraft, missiles, or submarines. Never again would battleships fire on each other. The tactics used at Surigao, crossing the T, radar-directed fire, mass torpedo attacks represented the culmination of centuries of naval doctrine, the final perfection of gun-based warfare, just as that warfare became obsolete. Oldendorf had achieved tactical perfection, destroying an enemy force without losing a single ship, demonstrating what happened when superior technology and better tactics combined against an opponent following outdated doctrine. But there was a second Japanese force approaching Surigao Strait that night. Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima's force, of 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 4 destroyers. Shima was supposed to coordinate with Nishimura, arriving simultaneously to divide American defenses. Instead, radio silence prevented coordination. Shima entered the strait 90 minutes after Nishimura's force was destroyed, steaming into waters littered with burning wreckage and survivors. At 0440 hours, Shima's flagship cruiser Nachi collided with Mogami, still burning from Nishimura's battle in a confused night engagement. Both ships were damaged. Shima, seeing destruction everywhere and realizing that Nishimura's force no longer existed, made the wise decision to retreat. His ships turned south and fled, pursued briefly by American destroyers, but ultimately escaping with damage but no ships lost. The strategic result was complete Japanese failure in the southern approach. Sho-1 had called for Nishimura and Shima to transit Surigao Strait, emerge into Leyte Gulf at dawn, and attack the invasion fleet from the south while Kurita attacked from the north. Instead, Nishimura's entire force was destroyed. Shima retreated without engaging meaningfully, and Leyte Gulf's southern approach remained firmly controlled by American battleships. The plan's 3-pronged attack had lost 1 prong entirely. Now everything depended on Kurita's center force in the north, and whether Ozawa's carrier sacrifice could keep Halsey occupied long enough for Kurita to reach the transports. Admiral Oldendorf's battleships couldn't immediately redeploy north to help against Kurita because they'd expended most of their ammunition. West Virginia alone had fired 93 16-inch shells and over 4,000 5-inch shells during the night battle. Reloading from ammunition ships would take hours. More importantly, Oldendorf couldn't know whether more Japanese forces might approach from the south. Prudence required maintaining a blocking position until the situation clarified. So while Taffy 3 fought for its life off Samar 100 miles to the north, the battleships that might have helped them sat in Surigao Strait, victorious but unable to influence the battle that really mattered. The contrast between Surigao Strait and Samar was stark. At Surigao, superior American technology and tactics produced one-sided victory with minimal casualties. Off Samar, inferior American forces achieved survival through sacrifice and courage, losing ships and men, but accomplishing the mission of stopping Kurita. Surigao represented warfare as admirals imagined it: controlled, calculated, efficient. Samar represented warfare as it actually happens: chaotic, desperate, determined by individual decisions under impossible pressure. Both battles occurred within hours of each other. Both were essential to defending Leyte Gulf, but Samar would be remembered long after Surigao was forgotten, because Samar revealed what men could accomplish when technology and tactics failed, when nothing remained except courage and the refusal to surrender. The destroyers that died off Samar bought victory more surely than the battleships that triumphed at Surigao, and their sacrifice would be honored long after the perfect ambush was reduced to footnotes in naval history texts. October 26, 1944, Leyte Gulf anchorage, 0800 hours. Pharmacist's mate, second-class Robert Billy, floated in oil-covered water, his life jacket keeping him barely afloat, watching the sun rise over a sea littered with debris and bodies. He'd been in the water for 11 hours since USS Johnston sank beneath him at 0910 the previous morning. Around him, other survivors from Johnston, Howell, and Samuel B. Roberts clung to wooden planks, empty ammunition cans, life rafts damaged and barely functional. Some men had died during the night from wounds or exhaustion, or simply giving up. Others had been taken by sharks that circled constantly, attracted by blood in the water. Billy had watched friends die, had held their hands as they slipped away, had sung hymns with men who knew they wouldn't survive until rescue arrived. Now, as the sun illuminated the destruction around him, he could see the full scope of what had happened: wreckage stretching for miles, oil slicks covering square miles of ocean, life rafts scattered across the water like orange dots on gray canvas. The rescue operations began at 0900 hours, when American destroyers arrived to search for survivors. USS Richard M. Rowell picked up Billy and 43 other Johnston survivors, hauling exhausted men aboard while corpsmen treated wounds and shock. The survivors told stories that seemed impossible. Destroyers charging battleships, escort carriers surviving 2 hours under fire from ships that outgunned them 20-1. Commander Evans ordering his crippled destroyer to continue attacking even after losing half his crew. The rescuing crews listened with growing respect, understanding they were hearing testimony about one of naval history's most desperate actions. Throughout the day, destroyers and destroyer escorts combed the battle area, picking up survivors from Gambier Bay, Howell, Samuel B. Roberts, Johnston. Of Johnston's 327 crew, 141 survived. Howell 86 survivors from 350 crew, Samuel B. Roberts, 120 survivors from 224. Gambier Bay, approximately 700 survivors from over 800 crew. Admiral Kinkaid's staff began compiling casualty reports and damage assessments as information filtered in from across the battle area. The numbers were sobering but could have been catastrophic. One light carrier sunk, Princeton, destroyed by Japanese land-based aircraft on October 24th, before the main battle began. 2 escort carriers sunk, Gambier Bay by surface gunfire, St. Lo by the first organized kamikaze attack in history. 2 destroyers sunk, Johnston and Howell. 1 destroyer escort sunk, Samuel B. Roberts. Multiple ships damaged, some seriously enough to require months of repair. Total American casualties, approximately 3,000 dead, several thousand wounded. In exchange, the Japanese had lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, over 300,000 tons of warships, roughly 40% of the combined fleet's remaining strength. The strategic balance had shifted decisively. Japan's navy ceased to exist as a viable fighting force after Leyte Gulf. The 4 carriers sunk off Cape Engano represented Japan's last carrier capability. Even those carriers had been nearly empty of aircraft, functioning primarily as decoys. The 3 battleships lost, Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea, Yamashiro, and Fuso at Surigao Strait, couldn't be replaced. Japan's shipyards were building submarines and small craft for coastal defense, not capital ships requiring years of construction. The cruisers lost represented years of training for their crews, expertise that couldn't be recreated quickly even if hulls could be built. Most critically, Japan had lost the ability to interfere with American amphibious operations. Future invasions, Luzon, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, would proceed without threat of Japanese surface forces attacking the invasion fleets. But the American victory had come close to disaster in ways that haunted senior officers who understood how narrowly catastrophe was avoided. If Kurita hadn't reversed course at 0925 on October 25th, if he'd continued attacking Taffy 3 for another hour, he would have sunk all 6 escort carriers. If he'd then continued south to Leyte Gulf, only 60 miles away, he would have reached the anchorage around noon, finding hundreds of transports and cargo ships anchored in predictable locations, defenseless against battleship gunfire. The scenario planners constructed afterward was nightmarish. Kurita's 4 battleships could have systematically destroyed the entire logistics base, sinking transports carrying fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies. The 6th Army would have been stranded on Leyte with limited supplies, unable to advance or possibly even sustain themselves. MacArthur's triumphant return would have become a desperate evacuation or a slow starvation campaign. Admiral King in Washington read the battle reports with mounting fury, focusing particularly on the command confusion that had left San Bernardino Strait unguarded. The divided command structure, Halsey reporting to Nimitz, Kinkaid reporting to MacArthur, neither admiral subordinate to the other, had produced exactly the coordination failure that King had warned about. Halsey assumed Kinkaid would guard the strait with 7th Fleet forces. Kinkaid assumed Halsey was guarding it with Task Force 34. Both assumptions proved wrong because neither admiral explicitly confirmed them with the other. King drafted recommendations for court-martial proceedings against Halsey, then reconsidered. Relieving or court-martialing America's most famous naval commander would undermine public confidence, would suggest American leadership was dysfunctional, would give aid and comfort to the enemy. Better to let Halsey continue, to learn from the mistakes privately while maintaining public support. The Japanese perspective revealed equal confusion and recrimination. Admiral Toyota in Tokyo had activated Sho-1 expecting low probability of success, but hoping for enough damage to make the Americans reconsider their Philippine strategy. Instead, the operation had consumed the combined fleet, while inflicting only modest damage on American forces. Kurita faced particular criticism for withdrawing at the moment of victory off Samar. His explanations varied and evolved over subsequent years. He thought he was fighting Halsey's fast carriers rather than escort carriers. Radio deception had confused him about enemy locations. His force was low on fuel. The ferocious destroyer attacks convinced him he was facing heavier opposition than actually existed. None of these explanations satisfied critics who believed Kurita had lost his nerve at the critical moment, that another hour of combat would have achieved Sho-One's objectives regardless of the ultimate cost to his ships. Ozawa received recognition for successfully completing his decoy mission. He'd drawn Halsey north exactly as planned, buying time for Kurita to approach Leyte Gulf. But the sacrifice of Japan's last carriers seemed meaningless when Kurita failed to exploit the opportunity Ozawa's sacrifice created. 4 carriers, 1,500 sailors, dozens of aircraft, all lost so that Kurita could approach the American transports, then turn away without accomplishing the mission. Senior Japanese naval officers who'd survived the war would spend decades debating whether Sho-One had any chance of success, or was simply an elaborate suicide ritual, giving the combined fleet an honorable death rather than allowing it to rust at anchor or be destroyed piecemeal by submarines and air attacks. The human cost extended beyond the 3,000 Americans and 12,000 Japanese killed during the 3 days of battle. Survivors faced psychological wounds that wouldn't fully manifest for years. Men who'd watched ships sink with friends trapped inside, who'd floated in oil-covered water for hours waiting for rescue, who'd seen limbs torn off by shrapnel or burns that consumed flesh down to bone. These men carried images that would haunt them for decades. Post-traumatic stress wasn't yet recognized as a medical condition in 1944. Survivors were expected to resume their duties, to put the experience behind them, to maintain the stoic composure that military culture demanded. Many did, burying their trauma beneath daily routines and wartime necessity. Others broke down weeks or months later, suffering what was then called battle fatigue, or operational exhaustion, inadequate terms for psychological damage that would persist for lifetimes. October 26th also brought the first major organized kamikaze attacks, a new dimension of warfare that would define the final year of the Pacific War. Escort carrier St. Lo, which had survived the surface battle off Samar, was struck by a Zero fighter, deliberately crashed into her flight deck at 10:49 hours. The impact and resulting explosions triggered fires in the ship's ammunition and fuel stores. Within 30 minutes, St. Lo's magazines exploded, breaking the carrier's back. She sank at 1100 hours, taking 114 men with her. This was the future of Japanese naval aviation. Pilots deliberately crashing their aircraft into American ships because conventional attacks had become ineffective against American air defenses. Over the next 10 months, 2,800 kamikaze sorties would damage or sink dozens of American ships, killing over 5,000 sailors, forcing the Navy to develop entirely new defensive tactics against enemies who couldn't be deterred by the threat of death. The Battle of Leyte Gulf formally ended on October 26th, when American search planes confirmed that surviving Japanese forces were retreating toward their bases in the South China Sea and the home islands. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet pursued Kurita's damaged ships as they transited San Bernardino Strait westbound, launching airstrikes that sank additional cruisers and destroyers. But the main Japanese forces escaped because they'd scattered, presenting multiple targets across hundreds of miles of ocean. American pilots pursued individual ships rather than concentrated formations, allowing many damaged vessels to reach safety. By October 27th, the battle was definitively over. American forces controlled Philippine waters. MacArthur's invasion could proceed without naval interference. The combined fleet had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. The strategic consequences extended far beyond the immediate tactical outcomes. With the Japanese Navy neutralized, American submarines could operate even more freely against Japanese merchant shipping, strangling Japan's economy and war production. The blockade of the home islands became increasingly effective. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies dropped from 600,000 barrels per month in September to 190,000 by March 1945. Rice shipments from Southeast Asia ceased entirely, creating food shortages in Japan. Strategic bombing intensified as Beta P-29s established bases in the Marianas and Philippines, no longer needing to fear Japanese carrier strikes. The path to Iwo Jima and Okinawa opened, bringing American forces within striking distance of Japan itself. But perhaps the most important consequence was psychological. Leyte Gulf convinced Japanese military leadership that conventional defense was futile, accelerating the shift toward desperate measures like kamikaze attacks, suicide submarines, and preparing for fanatical homeland defense. The battle demonstrated that material inferiority was overwhelming. No amount of courage or fighting spirit could overcome radar, massive air superiority, and industrial capacity that replaced losses faster than they occurred. This recognition didn't produce surrender. Japanese military culture couldn't accept surrender while the emperor remained in danger, but it did produce increasingly desperate tactics that would make the final year of the war extraordinarily bloody. The men floating in the waters off Samar on October 26th, rescued after hours of terror and loss, had survived history's largest naval battle. But they'd also witnessed the birth of warfare's darkest evolution. Enemies who couldn't be deterred by death because death was their weapon. November 3, 1944, Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz's headquarters. Commander Arleigh Burke sat in the outer office, waiting to be called into Nimitz's conference room, where Admiral Halsey was being interviewed about his decisions during the Leyte Gulf battle. Burke had served on Halsey's staff during the operation, had been in flag plot aboard New Jersey when the critical decisions were made, and now he'd been summoned to provide testimony about what happened and why. The atmosphere in Pearl Harbor's headquarters was tense, unusually formal. Nimitz was conducting an investigation without calling it an investigation, gathering information without formally convening a board of inquiry, determining whether Halsey's decisions warranted official censure, without publicly acknowledging that censure was being considered. The careful bureaucratic language couldn't hide the reality. The Navy was trying to understand how its most famous admiral had nearly caused the worst defeat since Pearl Harbor. Inside the conference room, Halsey defended his decisions with characteristic aggressive confidence. He'd gone north to destroy the Japanese carriers because carriers were the primary threat, had been the Navy's doctrine since Midway. He'd taken his entire fleet, not divided his forces, because naval doctrine emphasized concentration of strength. He'd assumed Kinkaid's 7th Fleet would handle any surface forces that approached Leyte Gulf, because the 7th Fleet included 6 battleships and multiple cruiser divisions, specifically assigned to protect the invasion fleet. These decisions were reasonable, defensible, based on doctrine and assumptions that seemed valid at the time. The fact that Japanese battleships nearly reached the transports resulted from Kurita's unexpected persistence after the beating his force had taken in the Sibuyan Sea, combined with Kinkaid's mistaken belief that Task Force 34 was guarding San Bernardino Strait. Nimitz listened quietly, making notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. He understood the political impossibility of court-martialing or even publicly censuring Halsey. The American public viewed Bull Halsey as a hero, the aggressive fighter who'd struck back after Pearl Harbor, who'd led victories at Guadalcanal and the Marshalls. Relieving Halsey would require explaining why, explaining that he'd been deceived by Japanese carriers serving as bait, that he'd left the invasion fleet exposed, that only desperate courage by destroyer crews had prevented catastrophe. Such explanations would undermine public confidence in Navy leadership, would give critics ammunition to attack the entire Pacific strategy. Better to handle this quietly, to ensure Halsey understood his mistakes without creating a public scandal. The specific controversy centered on the Task Force 34 confusion. Halsey had sent a message on October 24th stating, "If the enemy sorties, Task Force 34 will be formed." This was a preparatory order, telling Admiral Lee to be ready to form a battle line with fast battleships if needed. But Admiral Kinkaid, monitoring the same communication circuits, had interpreted the message as confirmation that Task Force 34 existed and was guarding San Bernardino Strait. This misunderstanding persisted for 12 critical hours, from 2000 hours on October 24th until 0800 on October 25th. While Kinkaid believed the strait was defended, and Halsey believed Kinkaid understood it wasn't. The communication failure resulted from assumptions on both sides, neither admiral explicitly confirming what the other was doing. Admiral King in Washington wanted heads to roll. He'd warned about divided command structures, had argued that one admiral should command all naval forces in a theater, that splitting responsibilities between 3rd and 7th Fleets, while both operated in the same area, invited disaster. Leyte Gulf proved him right. Divided command produced divided understanding, assumptions that weren't verified, coordination that failed at the critical moment. King drafted scathing critiques of both Halsey and Kinkaid, then filed them rather than sending them, because Roosevelt's naval aide explained the political impossibility of public controversy, while the Leyte campaign was still ongoing, and the election was days away. The critiques would remain classified for decades. King's fury documented but not acted upon. The Japanese perspective emerged slowly through interrogations of prisoners and post-war interviews with surviving officers. Kurita's decision to withdraw from the attack on Taffy 3 at 0925 on October 25 remained the central mystery. His explanations varied depending on when he was asked and who was asking. In late 1944, immediately after the battle, Kurita claimed he'd believed he was fighting Halsey's fast carriers rather than escort carriers. That radio intelligence had convinced him the main American fleet was nearby, that withdrawing was prudent to avoid being trapped. By the early 1950s, his story had shifted. He'd been concerned about fuel, about air attacks, about the ferocity of the destroyer resistance, suggesting heavier forces were present. In the 1960s and 70s, aging and perhaps more honest, Kurita's explanation became simpler. He'd been exhausted, nearly drowned 2 days earlier when Submarines sank his flagship, suffering from the psychological effects of watching Musashi destroyed and losing a third of his force before even reaching the Philippines. The decision to withdraw wasn't rational calculation, but the result of impaired judgment, physical exhaustion, and perhaps unconscious recognition that even if he reached Leyte Gulf and destroyed the transports, his entire force would be annihilated afterward, with no strategic impact on the war's outcome. This final explanation rang truest to historians, but was impossible to prove. Kurita's state of mind on the morning of October 25th died with him. Admiral Ozawa's role received mixed evaluation. Tactically, he'd executed his mission perfectly, drawn Halsey north, sacrificed his carriers, bought time for Kurita to approach Leyte Gulf. The fact that Kurita failed to exploit the opportunity Ozawa created wasn't Ozawa's failure. But strategically, some Japanese officers argued that sacrificing the last carriers for no gain was worse than preserving them for eventual suicide missions against American invasion fleets approaching Japan. The debate was essentially theological, whether dying gloriously in failed attacks was preferable to husbanding strength for homeland defense. Japanese military culture leaned toward glorious death, but practical officers recognized that 4 carriers, even with inexperienced pilots, might have inflicted serious damage on American forces at Iwo Jima or Okinawa, rather than being sunk accomplishing nothing at Leyte. The tactical lessons identified by the Naval War College's post-battle analysis were numerous and sometimes contradictory. Unified command was essential. Divided theaters with separate reporting chains invited coordination failures. Radio communication procedures needed reform. Preparatory orders must be clearly distinguished from execution orders to prevent Kinkaid-style misunderstandings. Carrier doctrine needed refinement. Were carriers truly always the primary target, or should context and strategic situation determine priorities? Destroyer tactics deserved study. The suicidal charges off Samar had worked, suggesting that aggressive close-range attacks by small ships could disrupt superior forces under certain circumstances. But which lessons were valid and which were artifacts of specific circumstances remained debatable. The media narrative, unsurprisingly, simplified everything into heroic American victory over desperate Japanese attack. Newsreels showed MacArthur wading ashore, carriers launching strikes, battleships firing in neat lines at Surigao Strait. The near disaster off Samar was presented as heroic defense rather than desperate survival, after command failures left the area exposed. Halsey remained the aggressive fighting admiral, his decisions vindicated by ultimate victory. Kurita became the coward who turned away from battle rather than the exhausted commander who made a complex decision under impossible circumstances. Public understanding of the battle bore little resemblance to the chaotic, confused, nearly catastrophic reality that participants experienced. Privately, officers who'd been present shared darker assessments. Commander Ernest Evans couldn't share anything. He'd gone down with Johnston, but his surviving officers testified that Evans had attacked without orders because someone had to buy time for the carriers, and doctrine said destroyers protected carriers even at cost of the destroyers themselves. The other destroyer captains who joined Evans' attack hadn't coordinated. They'd each independently decided that dying was preferable to watching carriers be destroyed. This wasn't tactics, it was individual moral choice under pressure, the kind of decision that couldn't be taught at the Naval Academy or codified in doctrine. The fact that such decisions had saved the invasion fleet suggested that warfare's human dimension remained more important than technology or planning. December brought formal conclusions. Nimitz's report to King praised both Halsey and Kincaid, while noting communications could have been more explicit. No formal censure, no relief from command. The Navy's official battle report, classified and circulated only among senior officers, was more blunt. The temporary absence of Task Force 34 from guard of San Bernardino Strait created a critical situation, which was resolved only through exceptional courage and sacrifice. Translation: Halsey screwed up, sailors died fixing his mistake, and we're not going to talk about it publicly. The report became required reading at the Naval War College, studied by generations of officers, learning what not to do, but the lessons remained classified until decades after the war ended. The battle's lessons would influence American naval doctrine through the Cold War and beyond. The 1947 National Security Act, creating unified commands with single commanders controlling all forces in a theater, directly addressed the divided command problems that nearly caused disaster at Leyte Gulf. Communication protocols were reformed to distinguish clearly between preparatory orders and execution orders. Carrier doctrine evolved to consider strategic context rather than treating carrier destruction as an absolute priority in all circumstances. But perhaps the most important lesson was the hardest to codify. Sometimes individual initiative and willingness to die can overcome superior force, but you can't plan for it or depend on it. The destroyers that charged battleships off Samar saved the invasion through courage that couldn't be predicted or replicated. That such courage existed was reassuring. That victory had depended on it was terrifying. December 15, 1944, Imperial Palace, Tokyo. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, Navy Minister, stood before Emperor Hirohito in the palace's underground conference room, preparing to deliver the assessment that everyone present already understood. The destruction of the combined fleet at Leyte Gulf had eliminated Japan's capacity for major naval operations. The Navy could no longer interfere with American amphibious invasions. Submarines would continue operating, though American anti-submarine capabilities made their survival increasingly unlikely. Surface ships remaining in Japanese waters would be confined to harbor by fuel shortages and air superiority that made any sortie suicidal. The Emperor's question was precise. Can the Navy prevent American invasion of the home islands? Yonai's answer was equally precise. No, Your Majesty. We can only make the invasion more costly through special attack forces and coastal defense. Translation: kamikaze attacks and suicide weapons were now the Navy's primary strategy. The strategic situation had collapsed with mathematical certainty following Leyte Gulf. American submarines, already sinking Japanese merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced, now operated with virtual impunity. In October 1944, before Leyte Gulf, Japan's merchant fleet totaled 4 million tons. By March 1945, it would drop to 2 million tons. By July, under 1 million tons remained afloat. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, which had justified Japan's entire southern expansion, fell from 600,000 barrels monthly in September to less than 200,000 by year's end. Rice shipments from Indochina and Thailand ceased almost entirely, creating food shortages in Japanese cities, where rationing reduced daily calories below subsistence levels. The naval blockade's effects cascaded through Japan's war economy. Aircraft production declined, not from bombing. American B-29s hadn't yet mounted sustained firebombing campaigns, but from lack of raw materials. Aluminum imports stopped, forcing manufacturers to substitute inferior materials that degraded aircraft performance. Aviation fuel quality dropped as refineries lacked crude oil to process. Pilot training, already abbreviated, deteriorated further when fuel scarcity limited flight hours to 50 or fewer before assigning pilots to combat units. The mathematical equation was simple. Losing Leyte Gulf meant losing access to resources that made continued conventional warfare possible. What remained was unconventional warfare. Kamikaze attacks, suicide boats, suicide submarines, preparing civilians for homeland defense with bamboo spears. The Philippines campaign continued through March 1945 as MacArthur's forces liberated island after island. Luzon was invaded January 9th. American troops landing at Lingayen Gulf with no Japanese naval interference because no Japanese naval forces existed to interfere. Manila fell in March after brutal street fighting that killed over 100,000 civilians. Throughout the Philippines, Japanese garrisons fought from jungle strongholds, inflicting casualties but unable to prevent ultimate defeat. The entire campaign cost roughly 8,000 American dead, 32,000 wounded. Japanese casualties exceeded 200,000 dead, many from starvation and disease, as the blockade prevented resupply. The Navy's failure at Leyte Gulf had doomed every subsequent defensive position in the Philippines. American strategic planning accelerated as Philippine bases became available. B-29s now had airfields closer to Japan, reducing flight times and allowing larger bomb loads. Fighter escorts became feasible for daylight precision bombing. Most ominously for Japan, preliminary planning began for Olympic and Coronet, the invasions of Kyushu and Honshu scheduled for November 1945 and March 1946. These plans projected American casualties in the hundreds of thousands, Japanese military and civilian casualties in the millions. The absence of Japanese naval forces meant American invasion fleets could concentrate entirely on defending against air attacks and submarines, not worried about surface action. Leyte Gulf had made homeland invasion logistics dramatically simpler. The Kamikaze campaign, which began almost accidentally during Leyte Gulf, became official doctrine in the months following. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, commander of 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, had authorized the first organized suicide attacks on October 20th, creating the Special Attack Corps that would conduct over 2,800 missions before war's end. The tactics were simple: load obsolete aircraft with bombs, fly them directly into American ships, guarantee hits by removing pilot survival from the equation. Early results seemed promising. St. Lo sunk, multiple ships damaged, American crews terrorized by attacks that couldn't be deterred. But the strategic impact was limited, because even successful kamikaze attacks sank relatively few ships while consuming aircraft and pilots that Japan couldn't replace. Iwo Jima and Okinawa became the testing grounds for kamikaze effectiveness. At Iwo Jima in February-March 1945, kamikaze attacks damaged several ships but couldn't prevent the island's capture. At Okinawa from April through June, concentrated kamikaze attacks achieved tactical successes: 34 ships sunk, 368 damaged, but still couldn't stop the invasion or force American withdrawal. The attacks were terrifying for sailors who faced enemies deliberately crashing into their ships, but they weren't strategically decisive. American anti-aircraft defenses improved, radar picket destroyers provided early warning, and most importantly, American industrial capacity replaced damaged ships faster than kamikazes could sink them. For every destroyer sunk, 2 more arrived from West Coast shipyards. The Naval General Staff's internal debates during this period revealed recognition that the war was lost militarily. Documents declassified decades later showed planners acknowledging that American invasion of the home islands would succeed, that Japan lacked resources to prevent it, but military culture and political structure made surrender impossible, while the emperor's safety remained guaranteed and the concept of unconditional surrender threatened the imperial system. So planning continued for homeland defense, mobilizing civilians, preparing suicide weapons, creating fortified positions in mountains where resistance could continue for years. Leyte Gulf had proven conventional defense was futile, but Japanese military thinking couldn't accept the logical conclusion. Negotiated peace before invasion became necessary. The post-war U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey analyzed Leyte Gulf's economic impact meticulously. The loss of the combined fleet hadn't directly crippled Japan's economy. Most of the economy's collapse resulted from submarine warfare and bombing, but Leyte Gulf had eliminated the Navy as a strategic factor, allowing submarines to operate more freely, enabling closer American bases, making the blockade more effective. The survey estimated that Leyte Gulf accelerated Japan's economic collapse by approximately 4 months, advancing the timeline toward either surrender or invasion. Those 4 months mattered enormously. They meant atomic weapons became available while invasion planning was still preliminary, rather than during an invasion in progress, creating the option to end the war without Operation Olympic. The British perspective, often overlooked in American naval histories, viewed Leyte Gulf as validation of their argument that the Pacific War should focus on blockade and bombing rather than costly invasions. The Royal Navy had advocated bypassing the Philippines entirely, letting starvation and strategic bombing force Japanese surrender without ground combat. Leyte Gulf seemed to prove this approach. The combined fleet's destruction had resulted primarily from American aircraft and submarines, not from infantry fighting for islands. But the British analysis missed the political dimension. American public opinion demanded visible progress, captured islands, liberated territories, MacArthur wading ashore. Blockade alone, however effective militarily, couldn't provide the dramatic victories that sustained home front morale. The long-term naval consequences extended into Cold War doctrine. The Navy's post-war structure emphasized carriers and submarines, while battleships were retired or mothballed. Leyte Gulf had proven that carriers dominated naval warfare, that battleships were vulnerable to air attack, that submarines could strangle an island nation's economy. This influenced NATO planning against the Soviet Union. Carrier groups would control sea lanes. Submarines would interdict Soviet shipping. Surface combatants existed primarily for anti-submarine and anti-aircraft roles. The fast battleship, which had seemed so powerful in October 1944, was essentially obsolete by 1946. Iowa and her sisters would serve again in Korea and the Gulf War, but as shore bombardment platforms, not as the decisive weapons naval planners had envisioned. Perhaps most significantly, Leyte Gulf demonstrated that quantitative superiority could overcome qualitative advantages. Japanese naval officers had believed superior training, fighting spirit, and willingness to die could defeat materially superior forces. The battle proved otherwise. American radar outmatched Japanese optical fire control. American damage control procedures outmatched Japanese flooding response. American logistics sustained operations where Japanese fuel shortages forced withdrawal. The lesson was harsh. Spirit couldn't overcome technology. Courage couldn't defeat industrial capacity, and wars between modern industrial powers would be won by factories and shipyards as much as by sailors and soldiers. This lesson influenced American Cold War strategy: maintain industrial superiority, develop technological advantages, ensure logistics could sustain operations far from home bases. Leyte Gulf showed these principles were decisive. March 20, 2001. Sibuyan Sea, Philippines. Paul Allen's research vessel Petrel floated above coordinates that side-scan sonar had marked as interesting, a massive object on the seafloor 3,300 feet below. Dr. Robert Kraft, Director of Undersea Operations, watched video feeds from the remotely operated vehicle as it descended through darkness toward whatever lay on the bottom. Then gradually shapes emerged from the gloom, a massive gun barrel, larger than any craft had seen in 40 years of underwater archaeology. More lights illuminated the scene: a turret, another, a third. 3 triple turrets, each mounting 18.1-inch guns. Only one ship in history carried such armament. They'd found Musashi, the super battleship that had absorbed 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs over 5 hours on October 24, 1944, before finally sinking with over 1,000 men aboard. She'd been lost for 57 years, resting in the darkness, and now cameras revealed her secrets. The wreck was remarkably intact despite the violence of her sinking. The hull sat upright, bow and stern sections separated, but both recognizable. The pagoda superstructure collapsed, but equipment still identifiable. Most poignant were the human artifacts: rifles stacked near what had been damage control stations, boots lined up outside crew quarters, dishes still in the galley, evidence of lives interrupted by catastrophe. Kraft knew that somewhere in this wreck were the remains of Captain Inaguchi and 1,022 sailors who died with their ship. Under international law and maritime tradition, this was a war grave deserving respect. The camera operators filmed respectfully, documenting but not disturbing, recording history without desecrating the dead. Musashi was one of 28 major warships sunk during the 3-day battle, across multiple locations. In the Sibuyan Sea alone, Musashi plus heavy cruiser Miyoko damaged and eventually scuttled. In Surigao Strait, battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, heavy cruiser Mogami, 3 destroyers. Off Samar, 3 heavy cruisers sunk by American aircraft pursuing Kurita's retreat. Off Cape Engano, 4 carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda. American losses were fewer but still significant: Princeton, Gambier Bay, St. Lo, Johnston, Howell, Samuel B. Roberts. Each wreck represented hundreds of men, thousands of tons of steel, years of construction, decades of naval tradition. Together they formed the largest concentration of sunken warships on Earth, an underwater museum of naval warfare's final evolution. The Philippine government declared the battle sites protected maritime heritage zones in 1999, prohibiting salvage and limiting visits to authorized researchers. The decision followed years of controversy over salvagers, who'd begun stripping wrecks for scrap metal. Particularly valuable was the steel produced before 1945 nuclear testing, which contains no radioactive contamination and commands premium prices for medical and scientific instruments. Salvagers had literally torn apart destroyer wrecks, cutting through hulls with torches, dismembering ships while ignoring the fact that human remains still lay inside. International outcry eventually forced protective legislation, but not before several wrecks were seriously damaged. The environmental dimension complicated preservation efforts. Oil continues leaking from sunken ships, 75 years after they sank. Battleship fuel bunkers held thousands of tons of heavy oil, designed to burn in boilers, but now slowly corroding through weakened hull plates. Estimates suggest over 20,000 tons of oil remains trapped in Leyte Gulf wrecks, and it's leaking at increasing rates as corrosion accelerates. In 2019, USS West Virginia's wreck in Pearl Harbor released oil that created visible slicks, requiring emergency containment. Similar releases from Leyte Gulf wrecks threatened Philippine fishing grounds and coral reefs. Eventually, perhaps within decades, the corroded hulls will collapse entirely, releasing all remaining oil simultaneously in catastrophic spills. Discovery of Johnston in 2019 by Petrel's expedition revealed new details about her final moments. The destroyer lies at 20,400 feet, deeper than any warship wreck previously located. Her hull twisted and broken, but bridge structure surprisingly intact. Video footage showed battle damage, holes from 8-inch shells, torpedo tubes torn away. The aft deckhouse collapsed, but also revealed how thoroughly Johnston had been shot to pieces before sinking. Forensic analysis of damage patterns confirmed accounts from survivors. The destroyer had continued fighting for over 2 hours after being crippled, Commander Evans refusing to surrender or withdraw, while escort carriers remained threatened. The wreck was a monument to courage, physical evidence of what men could accomplish against impossible odds. Survivor reunions brought elderly veterans to the Philippines throughout the 2000s to visit the waters where they'd fought. These men, now in their 80s and 90s, the last witnesses to history's largest naval battle, stood on decks above Surigao Strait or off Samar, remembering friends who died there 60 years earlier. Some threw flowers onto the water. Others poured whiskey in remembrance of shipmates who'd promised to share a drink after the war. A few broke down crying, emotions buried for decades surfacing when confronted with physical locations where traumatic events occurred. The reunions were bittersweet, celebration of survival mixed with grief for those who didn't survive, pride in accomplishment mixed with horror at what accomplishment had required. Japanese veterans faced more complicated emotional terrain. Cultural expectations emphasized stoic acceptance of defeat rather than processing trauma. Many survivors never spoke about their experiences, even to family, carrying memories privately until death. When Japanese veterans did visit battle sites, they often came alone or in small groups, conducting private ceremonies, avoiding publicity. The contrast with American veterans' public reunions was stark, where Americans remembered individual heroism and national triumph. Japanese veterans remembered collective sacrifice and ultimately meaningless death. Both perspectives were valid. Both groups had suffered terribly, but cultural context shaped how memory was processed and expressed. The archaeological value of these wrecks extends beyond historical curiosity. They represent a snapshot of 1944 technology: radar systems, fire control computers, damage control equipment, communications gear, preserved in the moment of use. Analysis of Musashi's armor showed exactly how American torpedoes penetrated Japanese defense schemes, information useful for understanding naval architecture evolution. Study of destroyer wrecks revealed details about how American ships were fought, which systems failed under battle stress, how crews improvised when equipment broke. This forensic archaeology helps historians understand not just what happened, but how and why, filling gaps that official reports left incomplete. The ethical questions surrounding these wrecks remain unresolved. Should they be preserved untouched as war graves, or does historical value justify careful excavation and artifact recovery? Should oil be removed to prevent environmental disaster? Or does that constitute disturbing the dead? Who owns these wrecks? The nations whose flags they flew? The countries in whose waters they sank? Or humanity collectively as world heritage? The Philippines claims territorial jurisdiction. Japan and the United States claim sovereign immunity for their warships, and international maritime law provides no clear answers. For now, the wrecks remain where they sank, slowly deteriorating, gradually releasing their oil, bearing witness to battles that ended naval warfare's centuries-old traditions. Standing on modern vessels above these underwater graveyards, researchers and veterans share a common recognition. The wrecks below represent warfare's terrible cost. Each ship was built by workers who never saw combat, operated by young men who died before reaching middle age, sunk in battles that were tactically complex but strategically simple, one industrial power trying to prevent another from taking resources needed for continued warfare. The complexity of technology, the sophistication of tactics, the courage of individuals, all these mattered, but ultimately the battles were decided by which side could build more ships, train more pilots, sustain operations farther from home. The wrecks testify to courage and sacrifice, but they also testify to waste, to the enormous resources consumed destroying each other, to young men dead in service of strategies that hindsight reveals were futile. The ghosts rest in darkness, their steel tombs slowly returning to the elements, monuments to valor and to the folly that makes valor necessary. October 25, 2019. Leyte Gulf, 75th Anniversary Ceremony. 3 elderly men stood on the deck of a Filipino naval vessel, hands on the rail, staring at water that looked peaceful on this sunny afternoon, but which 75 years ago had been filled with fire and steel and dying ships. Arthur Aftenblatten, 95 years old, had been a gunner's mate aboard destroyer escort USS Raymond during the Battle off Samar. Richard Dick Rhoda, 94, had flown Avenger torpedo bombers from escort carrier Kitcun Bay, making repeated attacks on Kurita's battleships with whatever ordnance his carrier could provide. Ben Highland, 93, had served aboard battleship USS Mississippi at Surigao Strait, manning a 5-inch gun mount, while his ship's 14-inch batteries fired on Yamashiro. They were among the last fewer than 10 verified Leyte Gulf veterans, remained alive in 2019, the youngest now in his 90s, mortality claiming several each year. The ceremony was small, respectful, attended by Filipino officials, American naval attachés, families of the 3 veterans, and a handful of historians. A Catholic priest led prayers in English and Tagalog. A Filipino children's choir sang hymns. Admiral Rodriguez of the Philippine Navy spoke about shared sacrifice and enduring friendship between nations. The American naval attaché read from President Roosevelt's statement after the battle, "The Japanese Navy has received a blow from which it will never recover." Then the veterans themselves stepped forward to lay wreaths on the water, flowers drifting away on the current, settling eventually over the wrecks that lay thousands of feet below. Aftenblatten spoke briefly when asked, his voice still strong despite his age. He remembered October 25, 1944, with absolute clarity. The morning when Japanese battleships appeared on the horizon, Raymond steaming forward to join the attack, shells falling so close the water spray soaked everyone on deck. "We didn't think about being heroes," he said. "We thought about protecting those carriers because if they went down, we'd have nothing between those battleships and all the guys on Leyte." He remembered Raymond launching torpedoes, turning away through smoke screens, emerging to find Gambier Bay sinking and Johnston dead in the water. He remembered thinking they would all die that morning, and the surprise when Japanese ships turned away, giving them life when death seemed certain. Rhoda's memories focused on his aircraft, the TBF Avenger, and the missions flown that day with whatever ordnance the carrier could load. "First sortie I had 2 500-pound bombs, meant for supporting troops. Second sortie was just machine guns. We'd run out of bombs. I made 5 sorties that day, and the last 3 were flying around making noise, pretending we were attacking, so those cruisers would maneuver, instead of shooting our carriers." He laughed, remembering it, though his eyes showed no humor. "One run I passed so close to a cruiser, I could see the Japanese sailors on deck. They were shooting at me with rifles. I thought, this is insane. I'm going to die being shot at with small arms while flying an airplane." He didn't die, obviously, but many of his squadron mates did, and he remembered their names 75 years later without hesitation. Highland's experience was different. Surigao Strait had been a decisive American victory, where his ship suffered no casualties. But he remembered the night vividly, the Mississippi's 14-inch guns firing into darkness, radar-directed fire against targets no one could see, the satisfaction when reports confirmed hits, the horror when dawn revealed the scale of destruction. "We'd turn that strait into a graveyard," he said quietly. "Thousands of men died that night, and we celebrated because they were the enemy." Years later, I think about those Japanese sailors, young like we were, following orders like we were, dying because their admiral sent them into a trap. They were brave too. We killed them anyway. The veterans' reflections captured something that official histories often missed: the human ambiguity of warfare. Yes, they'd fought courageously. Yes, they'd achieved victory. Yes, their sacrifices had been necessary for liberating the Philippines and ultimately ending the war. But none of those truths erased the memories of friends burning to death in sinking ships, of enemy sailors drowning in oil-covered water, of violence so intense it seemed reality itself had broken. The survivors carried those memories for 75 years, and the burden showed in how carefully they spoke, choosing words that acknowledged complexity rather than retreating into simple narratives of heroism and villainy. The question of how history should remember Leyte Gulf produced different answers from different perspectives. For the U.S. Navy, it was vindication of carrier warfare doctrine and industrial superiority. For the Philippines, it was liberation from Japanese occupation and the beginning of the path toward independence. For Japan, it was the final confirmation that the war was lost, that further resistance was futile, though that futility wouldn't prevent another 9 months of horrific casualties. For military historians, it was a case study in command failures, tactical innovations, and how battles once begun developed their own momentum, independent of commanders' intentions. All these perspectives were valid, but none was complete. Modern military academies study Leyte Gulf intensively, extracting lessons about command, communication, decision-making under uncertainty, and the fog of war. The Halsey-Kincaid communication failure appears in every course on joint operations, illustrating why clear command structures and explicit confirmation of orders matter. The destroyer attacks off Samar are analyzed in leadership classes, examples of how individual initiative can overcome material disadvantage. The Japanese plan, complex, dependent on perfect timing, requiring coordination between forces that couldn't communicate, is presented as what not to do in operational planning. Generations of officers have learned from Leyte Gulf, though whether they've truly internalized the lessons remains uncertain, until the next major conflict tests whether history's insights translate to modern warfare. The technological evolution since 1944 makes direct comparison difficult. Modern naval combat involves missiles fired beyond visual range, satellite targeting, autonomous weapon systems, cyber warfare, a completely different paradigm from battleships firing on visible targets. Yet fundamental questions persist. How do you command dispersed forces with imperfect communications? How do you maintain coordination when circumstances diverge from plans? How do you inspire men to face death when survival seems impossible? These questions were relevant at Leyte Gulf and remain relevant today, suggesting that warfare's human dimension transcends technological change. The memory preservation efforts, museums, documentaries, books, websites, serve multiple purposes beyond historical education. They honor the dead, giving meaning to sacrifices that might otherwise seem wasted. They warn subsequent generations about warfare's costs, the enormous resources consumed destroying each other, the trauma carried by survivors. They preserve lessons for future conflicts, though historians recognize that every war claims to be the war to end all wars, while preparing for the next. Most importantly, perhaps, they bear witness, acknowledging that these events happened, that men fought and died here, that their experiences deserve remembrance even as participants disappear and direct memory fades. The final challenge is what happens when the last veteran dies, when memory becomes entirely historical rather than living. Already in 2024, only a handful of Leyte Gulf veterans remain alive, and within a decade all will be gone. Their deaths will mark a transition. The battle will move from living memory into pure history, interpreted by people who never met anyone who was there, understood through documents and wrecks and photographs, rather than through veterans' voices. This transition is inevitable, part of how history works, but it's also loss of nuance, of emotion, of the human texture that survivors provided when describing their experiences. At the ceremony's conclusion, the three veterans stood together, arms linked for balance and mutual support, while the Filipino choir sang "Eternal Father, Strong to Save," the Navy hymn that generations of sailors knew by heart. The afternoon sun painted the water gold, the same water that 75 years earlier had been gray with smoke and red with blood, where destroyer Johnston charged battleships and earned eternal honor in dying. The veterans sang along, voices wavering but words clear, and when the final verse ended, they stood silent for a long moment, remembering friends who never grew old, who never knew peace, who never stood on decks in sunshine, remembering battles long past. Then they turned away from the rail and slowly made their way below deck, three elderly men who'd seen things they couldn't forget and survived experiences that defined their lives. Behind them, the water flowed on, indifferent and eternal, covering the wrecks and the dead, bearing no visible mark of what had happened there. But memory persisted in the veterans while they lived, in the records they left behind, in the wrecks that would remain for centuries, in the stories told by children to grandchildren, in the ceremonies held each October 25th. The battle was over, had been over for 75 years, but its meaning continued evolving as each generation interpreted sacrifice and courage and loss through their own circumstances and values. That meaning would persist long after the last veteran died, long after the wrecks corroded into unrecognizable ruins, as long as people cared about how humans behave when facing mortality in service of something they believed was larger than themselves. Leyte Gulf would remain not because the tactics mattered to future warfare, they didn't, but because the human questions it raised about duty, courage, sacrifice, and the cost of victory remained permanently relevant.